Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 3 of the Grindset stream, part 3 of Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. I'm once again joined by Logos. I see we have Kai Makata, Ricardo Williams, Cool Chickens, Vingel, and Peter all in the stream. Hello, welcome. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to me on Locals and follow me on Twitter and Telegram, as well as around the hour and a half mark, Logos and I'll take a brief break, as we've been doing already. And also, if and when we come across any other Moldbug articles that are merely about, say, poetry or literary criticism, or even, since he's a computer programmer, maybe the ins and outs of proper coding, we'll skip those. Those are not going to be directly relevant to the cathedral or any of his political musings. And so if we come across that, that's something that we'll probably skip over. But I don't think we'll have too many of those. But last week we had enough to, I think, merit that as a consideration. Also, Minoan, Liberty at LeSueur, hello. Okay. Roth, Casts, Chimps, and Rangor Dunung, May 10th, 2007. Conrad Roth, whose literary erudition, unlike mine, seems quite genuine. If the masthead isn't warning enough, readers should know that I've never studied any of the subjects I expound upon with such professional authority, and some commenters have already seen how easy it is to scratch my bogus polymathic veneer, does even make me the distinct honor of liking. I mean, doesn't just the name Conrad Roth sound like some celebrated literary figure? A man who might have clinked glasses with Sevevo and Trieste, slashed Robert Musil with the sword cane on the Ringstrasse, or consoled Edmund Wilson through his turbulent marriage with Mary McCarthy. I actually get the impression he's barely old enough to drink, but since myself am a failed child prodigy, I can hardly complain. Anyway, his blog, The Varieties, is well worth a visit. Conrad, if I may, is most interested by my failure to show the convention accepted by Hindu, Marxist, and Scholastic alike of ranking the castes, as if they were perpended to some great chain of being, with innocent, big-eyed apes poised just below the squalid poor, then horses and dogs, those noble beasts, and so on down to amoebas, lawyers, and real estate agents. I admit that this is a customary and sensible, and I should explain my deviation. I'm one of those who believe the human social behavior is not entirely learned. Chimps and other primates exhibit many social patterns that would strike any human as familiar. They form tribes, reciprocate grooming, spring, devastating ambushes in routine board meetings, and so on. One of these social patterns is, of course, linear ranking. In a stable chimp society, every chimp knows his or her rank versus every other chimp. This exacts a mighty mental tax on the little chimp brain, but enables these natural weightlifters to live together without constantly tearing off each other's genitals. If you ever find yourself in a fight with a chimp, I recommend the fetal position. We can think of this Rangdornung as a sort of simian version of formalism. The law of the chimp is that the little chimp shall yield unto the big chimp and all shall get along. When the system fails and ranks are unclear, chaos ensues. And this goes for humans as well, not just individuals, but castes. In chimp terms, the history of the last 200 years is a four-way genital-ripping battle royale of reproductive dominance between the old feudal clerical nobility, the new merchant nobility, various military brotherhoods, and what in the old regime France they called the noblesse de la robe, the scholar or Brahmin caste. The losers in this struggle may keep their actual gonads, but they lose their repeaters, the institutions which instill values and beliefs in the young. Since the Brahmins' victories of the 20th century, it is very rare for a young Western man to grow up in anything like an aristocratic or militarist tradition, or to learn business in the traditional apprenticeship style. Indeed, all are thoroughly Brahmanized, and if this doesn't take, then remained new cluturi vices, in a word, whatever their tax bracket. All right, so first of all is the idea of formal hierarchies in nature. Obviously, of course, when whether it's the lion pride or the chimp gang, the leader becomes old and enfeebled, and eventually one of the young chimps challenges to overthrow him and then does so. But here's the thing, though. If you're going to talk about rankings in animal social groups, first of all is animals clearly lack a certain level of cognitive capacity that puts them far below humans. So then the first question is, to what extent is this a relevant comparison? Because obviously the scope and breadth of human mental facilities far exceeds that of an ape or a whale or a squid. And then, second of all, there's this idea that it's sort of prioritizing status based on physical exertion, which, okay, that's a tech programmer. I don't think Moldbug or his legions would be able to do very well in. And since they're sort of positioning themselves as the proper heirs, again, this seems to be weak because, again, humans are more than, well, as I mentioned in an earlier stream, man is a rational animal, so we have animal capacities. But we have more than that. And so those who ought to rule, those who ought to lead, are obviously going to have more than just the mere animal capacities. And the other thing is, he seems to also then imply that, well, through some sort of struggle of martial dominance, then that proves the truth. Now, we shouldn't be surprised, since we know from the very first article on formalism, he's a essentially Stirnerite. But that does, I mean, and he's already dispensed with oughts, morality is just whoever has power. But one still has to think that this is a very problematic way of solving disputes, because might makes right is an informal fallacy. So it's no guarantee of determining A, who is true, and B, who is most competent to rule. Logos.
Yeah, I want to make this real simple. Let's just suppose everything he's saying is correct. We can map humans to animals. We can use animalistic behavior as a simple but fairly accurate model of human behavior. All that works. What strikes me as confusing here is he says two things in his own model that are completely at odds with each other. They can't both work together. The first thing he says is every chimp knows his or her place, and that is what makes peace in chimpland. The next thing he says is eventually old leaders get feeble, and the young people challenge them for leadership positions. Now, wait a second. How can the young decide they want to challenge the old for leadership positions if everybody knows who the leader is and everyone follows their place? That doesn't make any sense. Now, let's take that and rewind it back to the model of human behavior he's trying to say. Now, it's not a chimp that's being a leader; it's a system that's being a leader. It's a system of government. It's a rule of law, as he's fond of talking about, run by shareholders and executives and CEOs and all kinds of stuff. But all these people in conglomerate are representing a single system that supposedly has the power to rule. Now, just as the old chimp gets frail, how do you know and what do you do if a system equally gets old and frail? When a chimp gets old and frail, you can measure it. They move slower, they can't take a punch as easily. There's all sorts of physical ways to measure, but systems have more subtle ways of demonstrating if they get old and feeble and unresponsive, likewise. Whereas an older chimp, say, can't dodge a punch from a younger chimp as quickly as he used to be able to, it could be the case that an older system cannot adapt to new environments as quickly as a younger, more agile system can, whether it be war, disease, an economic shock like we're experiencing now with oil or something like that. If an old system is too bogged down in its ways, it's too formalistic, it can't move anything to be agile enough to meet the challenge at hand, it gets feeble. And a system that claims to be able to meet the challenge, whatever it may be, will assert it for dominance, and there's going to be a winner. Um, Furthermore, what what is the equivalent on formalism of a younger chimp beating an older chimp? It seems to me that it's a revolution. You have two systems, an older system versus a younger system, both of which try, fighting for dominance over all other competing systems. And how do you resolve that dispute? Well, chimps resolve it with violence. You resolve it with violence too. It's called revolutions. So it's not very clear, even by his own animalistic model, how formalism avoids the problem of violence and revolutions. Because once you ask the question, how does a younger chip usurp an older one? When you apply it at the level of like human systems of government, revolution seems to be the only answer that fits. So even under what he's saying, again, violence isn't avoided. Um, what's now just more murky is again what I said earlier, what an older chimp versus a younger chimp looks like. But then again, the issue is, whereas an older chimp versus a younger chimp can be resolved by physical tests, agility, stamina, strength, when you get to systems of government, the older versus younger, meeting situations, whatever, is a moral question. What does it look like for a system to fail to meet a moment and a system to not fail to meet a moment? Well, people might have different standards of that. Some people might think that governments should do nothing if Great Depressions happen. Some people think in the long run we're all dead. So try to help as many people and their families survive. Every child you're able to save, even at the cost of some long run economic comfort, is good, because that children will have children, they'll be patriots and so forth. Like, people will measure that differently. What does meeting a moment look like? And so the moral question is now going to creep in if you're going to measure what it looks like for a younger to beat an older one, um, in the systems of human government. So if he's intending for this analogy to do any work in either arguing for formalism or stating how it's better than its contemporaries, I think it does the opposite in every way. And at worst, it just leaves the reader more confused about like what he actually wants. At best, um, it doesn't actually show formalism is a very good system, and at worst, it shows formalism like in its own terms, like internally inconsistent as a system. So, ouch.
Yeah, the one thing I want to also add, riffing off what you said before I continue reading, is that terms that he's fond of using, like say friend, enemy, or the actual competency to do something, all of which he already precludes the possibility of answering and defining by ignoring metaphysics. He says that metaphysics isn't real, metaphysics doesn't affect reality. Well, all of these things, like friend, the definition I use is the one found in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, metaphysics, philosophy. If you want to say like what's the the structure, the way of things ought to be, that's a philosophical question. What's the underlying structure of the universe? That's metaphysics. So he's already cut himself off from the only way to answer these kinds of questions. And just further to drill us home is, if your goal is to find some sort of underlying formal structure, then the only way to find it is through insight, not just by a blindly following whatever institution happens to be in charge at the moment. Logos.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
All right, we'll keep reading. People somehow assume that this change is an automatic consequence of modern technology, as though DVD players were somehow incompatible with fancy dress balls, sadistic pseudo-Spartan boot camps, or learning a trade by actually practicing it. Of course, military history is for all practical purposes random, and surely if the Luftwaffe had won the Battle of Britain, you'd be reading this on the NS internet. I have to use delicate circumlocutions to try to convince my readers that young men and women might spend a little more time studying and a little less giving each other horrible facial scars with obsolete edged weapons. In any case, during this modern period, now ending, mainly because the Brahmins have reached the point where they have no real enemies left, and their credibility in conjuring up an optimate menace of Colonel Blimps, pedophilic cardinals, and servant-eating capitalists isn't what it once was, the linear Rangordung did not apply. Instead, there are two or more. I have lumped all the non-Brahmin elites in my ultimate cast simply because otherwise they wouldn't be enough to fill a decent ballroom, castes contending for big chimp spot. We see this most clearly when we look at the emotions different castes express toward each other. English at least uses a very different word for group emotional response depending on the rank relationship of the caste involved. For example, affection, as expressed from higher to lower, becomes caring or concern. So, for example, Brahmins care about the poor, Dalits and Helots. But when this same emotion goes from lower to higher, it becomes loyalty or respect. Not that Dalits have much of either, but I suppose Helots probably do. Historically, the relationship of reciprocal concern and loyalty normally felt between elites and their subjects is very common and remarkably stable. Likewise, animosity, when expressed from higher to lower, appears as contempt. Expressed from lower to higher, it comes out as resentment. No one could possibly mistake these emotions for each other. One key lacuna of Brahmin thought is a constant confusion and miscategorization of contempt and resentment. For example, the historical phenomenon that the Brahmins call hate is most certainly contempt. For example, the attitude of many whites towards many blacks in the Old South. The attitude of many Brahmins today towards many Vaisyas, for example, San Francisco hipsters versus peninsula suburbanites is also contempt. And in both cases, the reciprocal animosity was and is resentment. Yet Brahmins have a hard time engaging with this comparison. And they also have a hard time seeing that the genocidal outcomes of intricate animosity tend to spring not from contempt, but from resentment. NS, for example, was driven by the animosity of Mittelstand, Vaisya Germans for cosmopolitan Jews, resentment in a nutshell. The massacre of the Tutsis was pure resentment, and yet Brahmins is the envy against hate, and as they root out any traces of the optimate of Vaisya contempt with the Wiccaphobic fury of the Puritan progenitors, seems to put an awful lot of energy into the cultivating Dalit resentment. What so is unusual about the Brahmin optimate conflict is that their emotion is, or at least was, contempt on both sides. Their view of the conflict is perhaps the least recorded, but I am sure the late High Victorians lampooned by Luton Strachey felt exactly the same way about him as he felt about them. In other words, they found him pathetic, just as he found them pathetic. In every hominoid species, this is a recipe for the titanic violence, and so indeed it proved. Ultimately, this is a major reason why I don't consider myself a conservative or a member of the right. It is not that I don't agree with many of the thoughts of people like Larry Astor, but my goal is not to crush the Brahmins, not at all. My goal is to try in my own small way to remind them that they actually are the ruling caste, that their enemies basically no longer exist, that they can come down from the 20th century insane chimp rage without getting their genitals ripped off and eaten by lurking bands of equally enraged optimists. Okay, so this is very interesting again. Here, Moldbug has told us he's not a conservative and not a member of the right. So again, this just boggles the mind how he became this right-wing thinker, or at least associated with right-wing thinkers. Also, it bears repeating again that the Optimates are literally lineally descendant from the Puritans. So again, I don't know what Moldbug is talking about. With this idea of okay, so from the top down, from those in power to those below, he calls it affection, and for those from the bottom up, he calls it respect. Okay, as far as that goes, I'll go with it. And that sort of level of reciprocity seems to work as long as it goes both ways. Yes, but I think what we see now, especially if it wasn't obvious in 2007, is that it's not going both ways. And then he talks about hatred from the top down to the bottom up. From the top down, it's contempt, and from the bottom up, it's resentment. Now, what he wants to argue is that it's resentment that is motivating these revolutionary movements that are trying to overthrow. Well, actually, it's what's motivating the Brahmins, who overthrew the Catholic Church and the nobility and the landed gentry and all that stuff. But you see, this is what's interesting, right? Because if from his perspective, he wants to say that's resentment. But of course, if from the point of view of the revolutionaries, the landed gentry, the Catholic Church, the monarchies of Europe, the very problem we're facing now is the problem we were facing then. A tiny elite held almost all of the land. So, for example, in England today, I think something like 95% of the land is owned by either like the government or what's left of the noble houses or corporations. And so when you get to that stranglehold, you have this complete proletarianization of society, which makes it almost impossible for civil order to endure. We saw this in the late Roman Republic, which led to the civil wars. So I would argue that the civil wars that occur are not the result per se of resentment, though of course some leaders might be motivated by it, but by the impossible material conditions that most people find themselves in. And the obvious people to strike are those that are those that have centralized property in the hands of so few. Logos.
People might get tired of hearing this, but I'm kind of confused again. The first question he should answer before he goes into any of this, which I kind of alluded to before, but it's now even more prescient, is how does he measure who has the power? So, for example, suppose it's on the eve of a revolution like the 1917 Soviet Revolution. Now, the Reds weren't in positions of power at the time, so they weren't formally recognized as being powerful, but they did win the revolution. So, if the power is in the hands of it's just a physical fact at say time t, right? Let's suppose you're in a group of chimps. There's an old leader, and there's a strongest younger chimp that will beat him, right? If Moldbug wants to say that it's the younger chimp that has all the power at that time, even before he beats the older chimp, and that's why he deserved to beat the older chimp, then you'd apply that back to revolutions and so on. So then in 1917, the Reds had all the power. They were the top. They just hadn't been recognized yet because they hadn't beat out the old system. Now, if that's true, then his commentary of people getting confused between contempt and resentment is entailed even by his own model, because in 1917, the Reds had the power. Nobody knew it yet. So what looked like resentment when the Reds didn't have formal power, from the Reds' perspective, if they knew they had the power, was actually contempt. And then when they won the revolution, it's now contempt. But say a day earlier, when they didn't know if they were going to win, everybody else would have said it was resentment. So you enter a situation where this contempt resentment dichotomy is just purely in the eye of the beholder, and you just won't know until completely after the fact. The problem with that commentary is we're in the midst of a revolution. We haven't concluded one yet. We're still in the midst of the Brahmin class usurping power from older power structures, um, by his own model. And so, if the Brahmins are confused about whether hate is contempt or resentment, part of that confusion comes from the fact that, well, they just don't know that they've run the revolution yet. And so, proud Brahmins who think they've won, it's just a matter of time, would channel their hate as contempt. um, Brahmins who still see themselves as struggling against a system that's winning would see their hate as resentment. And you see this today when you think about like the idea of like oppression, right? It's not wrong to hate your oppressor, for example, is a phrase often modeled by the left. And this is where you get into the debate about where the right might say, like, well, left people, you control the media institutions, higher education, blah 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 blah. HR boardrooms. Like, what aspect of the systems of power don't you control, right? In what way are you oppressed, given all the stuff you control? And yet the left will still think they're oppressed because in their mind their revolutionary victory isn't finalized. So this question of hate versus of contempt versus the other one. Now I'm losing my train of thought. Right, just try to apply this commentary to today, and of course you'll see why it's muddled. But I don't think anything in his model is going to help clarify the confusion, given the epistemic problems at hand.
Well, he can't because he's already written off metaphysics. And so, as you said, early in a previous stream, Schrodinger's democracy, and now we're talking about, Schrodinger's fitness to rule. That just seems to be the underlying problem of any sort of robust materialism. There's no way to solve that problem because there's no way to step above it and look at it from an objective position.
Yeah, or even if you don't, if even if you wanted to like avoid the metaphysical question, right? I could see somebody getting mad and saying something like, "Well, assuming there is an objective position to look at it from is just assuming there is some metaphysical blah blah blah." Okay, let's put that to the side, right? The problem is, let's suppose you just end a revolution. Um, but let's suppose the losers of the revolution haven't given up just yet, and so we might be in the midst of another one. Like, how many times, Todd, you're the historian, have somebody want to have some faction rather won a Civil War revolution just for another faction in the Civil War revolution to like gain speed and come back like 5 years later and like take it from them, right?
All the time.
So even without assuming there is an objective position to look at this from metaphysically, the problem is you never know that you're out of the revolution. Even if we're in a formalist system and we give Moldbug here everything he wants, you never know if whatever system Moldbug chooses to formally acknowledge as the power structure, you never know when that's the young chimp and when that's the old chimp. It's always Schrodinger's young old chimp. Um, so even if we don't say the problem is it doesn't have metaphysics, the problem intrinsically with the system itself is exactly that Schrodinger's young chimp, old chimp problem.
Exactly. Okay, we're almost done with this article. I regard the strategy of trying to escape Vicia as Pat Buchanan's peasants with pitchforks into democratic politics as essentially counterproductive. What makes a Vicia is that he or she is a sensible, normal person who takes an appropriate and healthy interest in his or her life. Trying to involve these people in the disaster of democracy in some sort of attempt to restore a Brahmin-ravaged optimate culture that can be no more restored than Albigensian Provence or Mughal India, and which in any case was no more perfect than either of these wonderful and deceased societies, strikes me as an enormous mistake rather. It enrages the Brahmins and it achieves nothing. As the result, has been run by its civil servants, not its politicians since World War II. What is the glory and culmination of 40 years of American conservative politics since Barry Goldwater? The Bush administration, Your Honor, I rest. If Vicia votes are needed to help abolish our profoundly dysfunctional and moribund system of government, according to proper legal procedure, fine. But let them vote once on a proposition that is unambiguous and final and prevent them from ever having to concern themselves with ridiculous high school absurdity of electoral democracy so brilliantly satirized by Alexander Payne ever again. Until there's an election in which one box is a clear mandate for abolishing the New Deal, if not Washington itself, democratists, conservatives are wasting time and annoying the pig. Well, I think, now again, we haven't read this yet, so I might have to change my opinion, but in light of the fallout from his Elves versus Hobbits Substack article, I think we're beginning to see the germ of where that class divide is coming from. Moldbug is basically saying, know your place, Vices. I'm a Brahmin. I know what's best. Trust me. That really just sounds like what everybody was complaining about in its Elves versus Hobbits article. So maybe we're seeing here the germ of that later divide. Other than that, what do you got to say, Logos?
Well, it goes back to, I think, the second stream we did where we were looking at. No, it's part of the first one. Maybe it was the second one. They're all blending together. Where we were talking about, he was complaining about how academic institutions are getting taken over by the Brahmin class, right? And he's like, well, they're being taken over by the Brahmin class, and that's bad because they have this disdain, this hatred for all these conservatives or whatever. But where they resist it, they're not being taken over by the Brahmin, but they're too much like this. I forgot what the other category he called them was, but it was kind of like the WASP, economics driven.
Optimates.
Huh?
The Optimates.
Yeah, they're kind of optimate based, right? He's just like, yeah, but I'm a Brahmin at heart. I don't really have a liking for these optimates, right? And so I just can't accept the institutions that they become that way. And I said then, and now I'm just going to say now that it's like a no-win scenario, right? Because if they become too Brahmin-like, they become co-opted by the Brahmins who run them, which he's already acknowledged seem to vote as a bloc. And if they resist it, they just become something he already admits he disdains. And so they can't win. And so this is just basically that bled over into castes instead of institutions. So that combined with Schrodinger's old chimp, young chimp problem, I think that's basically the commentary I have to say on that article.
Okay. Consider the true cost of living without Wikiphobia, May the 10th, 2007. I love these generated pages. Though a variety of potent drugs are often prescribed for wikiphobia, side effects and or withdrawal symptoms can be severe. Moreover, drugs do not cure wikiphobia or any other phobia. At best, they temporarily suppress the symptoms through chemical interaction. The good news is that the modern fast drug-free processes of the CTRN Phobia Clinic will train your mind to feel completely different about witches and witchcraft, eliminating the fear so it never haunts you again. Ultimately, they don't seem to have anything for bushophobia. Okay, so this is supposed to be a little cute turn on his own side, the Brahmins, where he, says, well, you have this enlightened view of how people ought to view witches, but you don't extend it to Bush, who's part of your own class. Well, at least I think that's the implication, because if he was an optimate, then it wouldn't work. Do you have anything to say about that, Logos?
I think the Wikiphobia thing is more of like a WASP thing. I think Brahmins, even back in the 2000s, were more willing to be like Wiccans or really odd, deviant social identities.
No,
And
I agree, but the
yeah.
point that I'm saying is that the Brahmins who claim to be enlightened by not being Wiccaphobes are still Bushophobes.
Oh, I see. I got the feeling he didn't like Bush very much, so I don't exactly know what he's trying to communicate here.
You know what, Logos? People are going to get tired of this, but Logos is confused.
I'm always confused. Every time I read this guy, I'm just more confused.
I know. At least that's how I read it, and I was trying to steel man that, so we'll see. The Anti-Singularity, May 11th, 2007. I suspect most readers like me grew up learning to think of history as progress. But at UR, we care not for tradition. We accept no givens, we serve no idols. Au contraire, we crap on them, except a new crop of bitter, perverse screeds against democracy coming soon. So it's worth asking, is history actually the story of progress? Or were we just told to think so like good little school bots? The idea of decline a la Spengler is unfashionable these days, but of course it has featured prominently in many cultures and civilizations such as classical China, the Roman Republic, various Catholic traditions, etc., etc. And as Dio Gowolf points out, universal faith is in progress is evident for not against decline. Still, we have HDTVs and 500 gig hard disks. Did Marcus Porcius Cato ever have either of these conveniences? Did Oswald Spengler, for that matter? So perhaps we can sneer at them after all. Spengler was an ass. Cato walked around flanked by fast keys wielding lictors. The past is darkness and superstition. The future is fiber optics and universal enlightenment. Ray Kurzweil, whose synthesizers gave us a whole era of death disco, and who's certainly a very smart man, has taken the idea of progress to an extreme and predicted an event he calls the singularity. In the singularity, computers grow so smart they design themselves, making them even smarter than Kurzweil, and so ad infinitum. Kurzweil expects this as soon as 2035. I am no Kurzweil, but I know a thing or two about computers. I don't find the singularity improbable at all. Certainly, technical processes accelerate itself exponentially. I think 2035 is a little soon, but I have no strong feelings on the issue. But historical progress, Whatever that may be is something else. History is littered with the ruins of failed civilizations. Without getting into the trap of defining progress or decline, surely we can agree that Rome fell and Babylon is no more. They didn't rename the Forum the Campo Vacchino for nothing. History is not an experiment. We can't separate social progress or decline from technical progress. We do, however, have imaginations, and we can imagine them separately. In the last 200 years, we have seen enormous technical progress, the Industrial Revolution, clearly the leading edge of the singularity, exponents everywhere. Small exponents, but exponents. But in 1776, Edward Gibbon wrote, "We may therefore acquiesce in the pleasing conclusion that every age of the world has increased and still increases the real wealth, the happiness and knowledge, and perhaps the virtue of the human race." Clearly, dude hadn't a definition of progress. So I think the interesting thing here so far is we can't separate social progress or decline from technological progress. Now, it's not entirely clear what he means by this, but almost all talk of social progress over, say, the last 200 years has been directly tied to industrial or technological progress. And in my, was it 2 weeks ago, discussion on culture and simulacra, I talked about how there has to be a reform of manners and morals for each level of the simulation. And that is what we call progress. Because in order to serve the new material conditions that the new simulation is giving us, we need to have new manners and morals. The other thing is here, without going into the arguments that I think Logos and I we've already discussed, the idea of the singularity in AI is patently absurd. I've talked about that elsewhere in other channels, so I won't get into it here. Other than the fact that, Mary's room experiment more or less effectively refutes AI. And then also, Gibbon did believe in progress. I mean, obviously, I read Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and possibly maybe Moldbug did too. I don't know. But he does view idea. Now, maybe progress isn't inevitable, right? But he was certainly an Enlightenment-style thinker and viewed a restoration of something like Rome as an ideal. And, even if we look at, say, the Brahmins that he's talking about, they still believe in the idea of the possibility of a decline and degeneracy. They would view it as superstition and racism. So think of The Handmaid's Tale, which, while wasn't a TV show, was a book back then. And that sort of American Taliban, hysteria that was going on at the time was their version of the barbarians at the gates. So it's not even the Brahmins don't have a concept of decline. Or, this is, again, the heyday of new atheism. So, science literacy. And so, science illiteracy is decline. So I think I would argue against the fact that these people in charge, who he calls the Brahmins, don't in fact actually have a view of decline. They just view that their success is not decline.
Yeah. I agree with Moldbug here that we should be skeptical of the idea of historical progress, but I think it's for different reasons. I think Moldbug ultimately is going to have to reject it because he doesn't think there are any oughts about how society ought to be, but rather just way society is dictated by those in power. And so that alone is sufficient for Moldbug to just discard the idea of progress. Moldbug system would just be a sequence of meet the new boss, same as the old boss kinds of things, where new bosses take over, they institute new rules, and ad infinitum. Some people might like the new rules more than the old ones, vice versa, but them's the breaks. You're just going to have people in power dictating new rules, and that's going to be the end of it. I would disagree with the idea of social progress because I think that progress is inherently normative. And like you said, the norms of people are in part affected by what the technology is of the day, dictating what the social norms should be to make the system run smoothly. That's one aspect of it. Other aspects of it too is that people do have norms independent of that as well, and so they might like or not like where society is going, and so you're always going to get that kind of like that little tug of war. So that's one thing. To clarify the part you're talking about where he says you can't separate technological progress from social progress, he means in the sense that you can't do repeated trials to untangle variables.
Oh, right. Yeah. History is not an experiment, he said.
Exactly. Yeah. And so while you look back at history, you're always going to see given levels of technology and given levels of quote unquote progress, whatever one's definition. And there's no way to kind of like rewind the clock controlling for different levels of technology. Let's just try the Stone Age again, but have these different social norms instead of these other social norms and see what happens, kind of thing. You're kind of stuck with the combined variables you had as history kind of like, worked its way to now. Um, yeah. I don't think I have too much more commentary on this one.
Okay, just as a brief aside, where I left off. So Moldbug wasn't saying Gibbon didn't have an idea of progress. He said that he did. So I must have just missed something there. But going on, don't you think that if whoops, where was I reading that? Right. Okay. Don't you think that if Gibbon could see the state of the world in, say, 1976, he might want to edit the prediction a little bit? He would certainly keep the knowledge, probably the wealth, maybe even the happiness, but virtue, by our definition, perhaps not by his. 20 years after Gibbon wrote, the Jacobins were making leather out of human skins. Read Gibbon's passage, which is justly famous. There is no presentiment at all of the incredible barbarism that would erupt, not in Papua New Guinea, but in France, Germany, Russia, and North America. Europe may have perfected total war, but it didn't invent it. Now imagine the history of the last 2 centuries with these brutal wars of totalitarian democracy, but without the industrial revolutions, or even forget the wars. Imagine all the political, economic, and cultural changes of Western civilization, the explosive growth of the centralized state, the rise of the criminal classes, and the destruction of legal clarity, the disappearance of craft, training in the arts, the libertarian sclerosis of industry, and the replacement of uniform warfare by suicide bombing, colonization of the first world by third world peoples, and above all, the tremendous narrowing of the mind that has destroyed any intellectual tradition which dared to deviate by a millimeter from the chiliastic faith of the Allied victors, the moral catechism of the Baedeker raids, a robot and crypto-Christian universalism, a disaster that still adorns itself with the Orwellian names of diversity, human rights, and multiculturalism, but resembles nothing so much as the Catholic Church at her inquisitorial Cathar roasting worst, but without any 500 gig hard disks or HD TVs. Let's call this the weak anti-singularity hypothesis, the idea that technical progress and social progress are uncorrelated and may even run in opposite directions. The weak anti-singularity hypothesis doesn't mean the singularity won't happen. What it means is that the technical process has overcome the declining trends in Western society. Perhaps in the absence of the Industrial Revolution, the experience of late antiquity would have been revisited. An Uzbek horseman would be sauntering across the ruins of Paris. But we do have the steam engines, the SUVs, and the HDTVs, and while we have the singularity, exponential technical acceleration has broken the savage cycle of history. Unfortunately, there's also a strong anti-singularity hypothesis. The strong anti-singularity hypothesis suggests that the coincidence of technical progress and social decay is not in fact a coincidence. It's actually a case of cause and effect. It's very easy for technical progress to cause social decay. Evolution designs humans to compete in a variety of brutally selective environments. When robots or helots do all the work, why bother? We can just sit on the couch, play Xbox 360, smoke green button, jack off fanatically. Idiocracy beckons. If technical progress actually causes social and political decay, Mike Judge is an optimist. What happens when the singularity really approaches, but it's not quite here? When the curve of technology is almost vertical, but not yet infinite. Damn, yo. What the strong anti-singularity hypothesis suggests is that we haven't escaped the cyclical pattern at all. We are just in an unprecedentedly steep upcycle. The Uzbeks may yet water their horses in the Seine, if there are any Uzbeks left, or horses for that matter. Okay, so let's see here. First thing that caught my eye was, what does he mean by totalitarian democracies? Okay, a book by J.L. Talman, and I guess it's referring to the French Revolution. There's no commentary on Amazon for it. But wait a minute, right? I thought so. Apparently, a lot of these groups are simultaneously democracies, like the Italians and the NS, but also autocracies. Again, back to Schrodinger's formalism. The other thing is, I will admit that the modern system, and I've said this before on my own, Moldbug is correct in saying that the nearest analog would be something like the medieval Catholic Church as far as scope and purpose, as a sort of doppelganger version of. The thing, though, that I would point out here is that he attributes, again, too much to the elites. So he talks about the Allied victors of World War II. He also talks about, but here's the thing though. Progress, and in one sense, when he says that progress doesn't necessarily moral or ethical progress, or as he said earlier, virtue doesn't increase with technological development. He's technically true, but here's where he gets muddled, right? The mechanism that we define as progress is each new social condition that is compatible with the current level of material development, the new levels of manners and morals. Now, that has to be called progress because the system needs people to willingly embrace each of the next steps. So, and again, my Culture and Simulacra episode, I talk about how it primes you for that. And so they call that progress because it has a positive connotation to it, and it then goes apace. Now, there is such a thing as, say, moral progress, say, such as when the Roman Empire in the West and in the East started to embrace Christianity, they outlawed things like crucifixion and gladiatorial contests, which you could argue is a kind of moral progress. And the confusion arises is that when the technocrats, who again, that's the class that Moldbug comes from, conflate the two. But they're not at all the same thing. And one is just called that to piggyback on the implied virtue of the former in order to justify the shifting of social conditions to each new stage of the machine. And as far as escaping the fundamental cycles of history, I would agree with Moldbug that we haven't. A lot of the predictions I've made in recent years are based on that fact. And Russia and China have been living up to those predictions and expectations.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Moldbug's anti-singularity model, which says that well, technology is getting better and that's aiding in our social decline, so to speak. Because I think he's talking about social decline as just kind of like the unwillingness for people to engage in, I guess, social and peer competitions, vying for positions of hierarchy, trying to vest power in the system. So Moldbug's implicit definition of progress here, maybe it's explicit, but I missed it, seems to be a functioning society in which everybody, driven by competition and other considerations, attempts to find the highest place in the hierarchy they can find for themselves. And I think Moldbug's model is implicitly saying that they'll do that when they can achieve a level of social comfort dependent on how high they make it up in the hierarchy. For Moldbug, I think the problem is once technology gets too good, the baseline level of social comfort gets so high that, as Moldbug says, why bother? Let's just play Xbox and do whatever else because we already have our minimum level of comforts, and so we're just going to stay home. And as people do that, the system breaks down because you don't have people competing in the dog eat dog contests of competence, and that's where you're going to see the system kind of start falling apart at the seams. And in some ways, he's right about that. And we're seeing the fruits of that in modern day. You bring up often, Todd, that most people, like I don't want to say most, but many young adults just can't pass a physical fitness test to join the military, for example. So even if we need these people in a time of war, we'd have to conscript them and just waive the physical test requirements and hope for the best. And that would be like a symptom of what Moldbug's talking about. So I think Moldbug's right here, and he's talking about roughly the same kinds of things that we've been talking about. But I also think that we have a lot of hindsight because, as Moldbug said, Spangler and civilizational decline wasn't, big back in 2007. In fact, I think we were still on the heels of Fukuyama's end of history nonsense.
Just one proviso. The only group that was big on that were radical environmentalists, and they were on that train for already 40 years.
Yeah, the environmentalists definitely. Yeah, as far as the general zeitgeist of the culture, though, I think Moldbug's right that people weren't really thinking about Spangler. But I think post 2012 and certainly to 2016, Spangler's been on our minds, and so we've had Moldbug's content and other analyses of Spangler and other people to piggyback on. So some of this stuff looks obvious to us, but I gotta give Moldbug some credit here for kind of thinking in these terms as early as he did. So
Yeah. Okay, Watch the Wide Sea, May 12th, 2007. By unpopular demand, Robinson Jeffers, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor appealed in the Double Axe in 1948. Random House censored 10 poems from the book and added a statement noting that they did
Is
not
this another
endorse.
poetry blog?
Well, yeah, but I think it's going to be political. It's called Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
So I think there might be some revisionist history here. I want to see if there is. They did not endorse Jeffers' political views. Recent editions have the missing verses restored. Indeed, the Double Axe essentially ended Jeffers' literary career, though in recent years he has been rehabilitated as a sort of eco-poet, which I'm sure he would have found hilarious. Jeffers' inhumanist philosophy has about as much in common with today's humanists, essentially Christian environmentalists, as the Visigoths with Joy Division. Pearl Harbor. Here are the fireworks, the men who conspired and labored to embroil this republic. And there we go. This is what I thought it was going to be good. To embroil this republic and the wreck of Europe have gotten their bargain, and bushels more. As for me, what can I do but fly the national flag from the top of the tower? America has neither race nor religion, nor its own state, nor its own language, nation, or nothing. Stare, little tower. Confidently across the Pacific, the flag on your head, I built you at the other's war's ends. And the sick peace I based you on a living rock, granite on granite. I said, look, Greystones, civilization is sick. Stand a while and be quiet and drink the sea wind, and you'll survive civilization. But now I'm old, and oh, stones, be modest. Look, little tower, this dust blowing is only the British Empire. These torn leaves flying are only Europe. The wind is the plane propellers. The smoke is Tokyo. The children with butchered throat was too young to be named. Look not far ahead. Look no further ahead. Oh, oh, that is it. Okay. The war that was we have carefully for years provoked catches us unprepared, amazing, indignant. Our warships were shot, little sitting ducks in our planes like nest birds. Both our coasts ridiculously panicked, and our leaders make orations. This is the people that hope to impose on the whole planetary world an American peace. Oh well, not lose our war, my money, or on amazed Gulliver and his horse pistols. Meanwhile, our prudent officers have cleared the coast-long ocean of ships and fishing boats, the sky of planes, the windows of light. These clearings make a great beauty which the wide sea, there is nothing human, its gulls have it. Watch the wide sky all day cleaned of machines, only at dawn and dusk on military hawks pass. High on patrol, walk at night in the blackout. The fireflies, lights that used to line the longshore are all struck dumb. Shut are the shops, mouths dark the houses. Here the prehuman dignity of night stands as it was before and will be again. Oh, beautiful darkness and silence, the two eyes that see God's great staring eyes. So basically, this is what I thought it was going to be. A sort of poem pointing out that the United States government under FDR deliberately provoked Japan into attack. And he's writing this in 1948, so the Cold War is already in swing. So it sounds like he's saying that the kind of, because the Cold War, had the threat of nuclear annihilation. And so he seems to be saying that a worse fate mankind is going through because of this conflict that we provoked, which, as far as it goes, I agree with it. I've talked about this a lot before in some of my backlog for anybody that's interested. And we're seeing the same pattern repeated in the Ukraine. Logos.
Yeah, I don't have much to comment on poetry.
Even history?
Not that either.
Okay, well, we're moving on. The Iron Polygon, Power in the United States, May 12, 2007. In case it isn't already clear to my readers, the small but discerning bunch, one of our primary goals here at UR is to paint a simpler, more compelling picture of present history than either the official history or any of the many well-known counter-narratives. Last week I covered the U.S. caste structure and communal factions. This week we'll be looking at power, what it is and who has it. As a formalist, I define power as the ability to change the rules or to clarify them when no rules exist. In a mature, sclerotic mega state like the US, it can be very hard to see where the power is because by historical standards, there is almost no change in the US. Okay, well, let's just stop right here, Logos. As a formalist, I define power as the ability to change the rules or to clarify them when no rules exist. Well, then, by his own definition, Lenin was a formalist and fully justified in clarifying the rules in Russia.
Yeah, and the totalitarian democracy of the French Revolution was a formalist system because the tyrannical democracy had the power to change the rules in France.
And clarify them.
Exactly. I mean, just more broadly, going back to the monkey analogy or the chimp analogy, right? who's the young chimp, who's the old chimp. Whoever's the young chimp has the power to change and clarify the rules. Whoever's the old chimp has to step aside because the younger one's the stronger one. So who is or isn't the avatar of the formalist society is basically he who is or isn't the young or old chimp. And so this whole Schrodinger's democracy thing can now be abstracted further in a more clarifying way, and just Schrodinger's young chimp, old chimp. And I think that's just going to be the lens I look at his model with going forward.
Also, going back to his original formalism article, this not only does not reduce violence, it necessitates that violence be the only means necessary to determine who is in charge.
Definitely, because if we're using the Schrodinger's analogy, right, you don't know what happens until you open the box. So you don't know if you're the young chimp or the old chimp until you open the box. Well, what does opening the box look like? A violent contest of power. So there we have it.
Bingo. Okay. But this does not indicate an absence of power. It indicates a balance of power. It means that various forces exerting pressure in various directions cancel each other, at least momentarily. One of the best features of the current U.S. regime, and one of the worst, is that it's much easier to prevent change than to create change. The compromise is generally the status quo. But if some deus ex machina could remove one of the opposing power centers or point one in a new and unopposed direction, we'd see instant and explosive change. The whole city of Washington is in the power business, and they don't screw around. Indeed, kids in schools are taught that the U.S. is balanced by separation of powers, but the power structure they learn is the original design of the Constitution, is borrowed from Montesquieu, legislative, executive, and judicial. This is like saying Caramo has 250 horses under the hood. It's true in a certain metaphysical sense, but it's not actually true. Metaphorical sense. In the same sense, the Roman Empire never thought of itself as anything other than the Roman Republic. By my count, Anglophone North America ex-Canada is on its fifth legal regime. The First Republic was the congressional regime, which illegally abolished the British colonial governments. The Second Republic was the constitutional regime, which illegally abolished the Articles of Confederation. The third regime was the Unionist regime, which illegally abolished the principle of federalism. The Fourth Republic is the New Deal regime, which illegally abolished the principle of limited government. Well, let's just go back to his definition here at the beginning of power. Power is the ability to change and clarify the rules. So clearly, none of these were illegitimate regimes. They were clearly clarifying ambiguities that were already in existence in these earlier systems. I don't see a problem here.
Yeah, by what moral standard is he declaring them to be illegitimate, right? He wants to remove all moral oughts about who ought have power, who legitimately holds power. And he claims to only want to care about descriptive facts about who does or doesn't have power. So really all he's doing is describing a history of who has power in the United States. And the word illegitimate is doing absolutely no work in his system.
Yeah, it's a self-performative contradiction. It's doing something he says that can't be done. Of course, all these coups are confirmed by the principle of adverse possession. Otherwise, we would find ourselves looking for the rightful heirs of Metacom or Edward the Confessor or whatever. Nor is there any automatic reason to treat any of these five regimes as better or worse than any of the others. If, like me, you're tired of the Fourth Republic and would like to see it abolished, all we know about its successor is that it will be the Fifth Republic and has no need to resemble the Third, the Second, or the First. The real legal nature of the Fourth Republic is that, like the UK, it has no constitution. Its legitimacy is defined by a set of precedents written by the New Deal judges in the 1930s. These have obscure names like Footnote 4, West Coastal Hotel, and Wickard v. Filburn. These precedents establish the Fourth Republic as universal and absolute government, subject only to a few isolated limitations which in practice do not matter at all. For example, no European country has any clear equivalent of our First Amendment, either in its original meaning or in its Footnote 4 restatement. If dissidents are being lined up and shot in stadiums in Europe, I have somehow remained ignorant of it. Constitutional law in the Fourth Republic is very real and a very substantial body of law, but its connection to the original charter of the Second Republic is entirely nominal. No, the U.S. government is the 800-pound gorilla. It sits wherever it wants, but it's not one entity. It is, again, a network of competing power centers. The closest well-known equivalent to the way I see the Fourth Republic's power structure is a concept that dates to the 60s, the Iron Triangle. The Iron Triangle is certainly real, but for some reason, no doubt related to the agenda of the official intellectuals who created it, it's missing most of its vertices. In fact, what we're looking at here is an iron polygon. So before he explains the polygon, again, I don't see how the Fourth Republic is illegitimate. Well, he says it's tyrannical, but that all that means, again, that's not doing any work in his system. All that's meaning, which is a good thing for him, is that it's formally declaring who's got the power, and it's the federal government that has the power. And so now the federal government is clearly stating in footnote 4, West Coast Hotel, and Wicker v. Filburn that it has the power. So technically it meets the formalist matrix. And then the other thing, he seems to be confused as to why the government's growing, or at least not giving us his real opinion on it, because the growth of the federal government is primarily the result of two things, right? One is the growth of industrial capital, which at the time nobody who was part of the Constitutional Convention had any idea would develop. I mean, they had vague notions of the East India Company, but they couldn't envision, or at least didn't envision, something like that developing in the United States, just minus the Army, which has global reach. How would the federal government deal with that? Well, actually, there's three things. So dealing with those, and the New Deal was ostensibly to regulate them and to prevent a communist revolution from the workers, as we saw with the Wagner Act of 1935. Second of all, directly related to the rise of these megacorps was the industrial and now technical infrastructure that has to be managed. They're not legal entities. You have all these, power lines and factories and infrastructure that didn't exist before that has to have some sort of legal recognition as property. And so the government has to expand to deal with that. And then second of all, there's all the externalities that come from megacorps and technology that the government then has to clean up after, because again, it'll just collapse in a Great Depression or something if it doesn't. Or if you don't buy off the workers, you have a communist revolution. All of which, and again, the class that Moldbug is a part of is the tech class, which back in 1930 would have been electricity and fission rather than digital technology. But that's imposing all the costs on the country, which the federal government is always playing, is always two steps behind trying to catch up. But that's what's driving the growth of the federal government, Lewis.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair analysis.
Okay. The key to power in the Fourth Republic is that no one who has power wants anyone to think of them as having power. For example, in the traditional Iron Triangle, legislators do not have power. They are just expressing the will of the people. Civil servants do not have power. They are just making public policy. Lobbyists do not have power. They are just communicating their concerns. This is profoundly Orwellian situation. The roots of the problem is that the modern English language has no word which means power, but carries only positive connotations. Perhaps the most important fact about power is that they are powerful, are almost always sincere. They honestly believe they are doing good. Every Sauron believes himself a Boromir, and as Acton observed, every Boromir has an inner Sauron. Since this is widely recognized, and since power is generally associated with evil, the people in the United States have actual power, do not and cannot think of themselves as having power. However, they are euphemisms for it. Perhaps the most common is responsibility. All right, just here, what I'll say is, well, okay, I'll agree partially. There are people that want to couch their self-aggrandizement as a sort of public service. But I think, though, this broader issue of the problem of identifying who's in charge. So you have all these moving parts, who's in charge, but then, and who's not in charge, is not really adequately explained by pointing out to the obvious bad actors who hide behind the idea of a common good. What is doing a lot of the work here, IRL, is that as we have increasingly complex systems, it becomes increasingly difficult to associate who does what. So imagine you have an organization with 10 men in it, and you have a relatively intelligent CEO boss who maybe doesn't know all the intimate details of these activities, but sort of knows how they all work together. Now imagine if instead of 10, we had 10,000. Each one of those positions was a PhD position. And, you quickly realize that no one individual or group of individuals could actually understand all of this. But because of that, it becomes very difficult to see who's doing the real work here. And also, as work is done by machines and not people, is a machine responsible? Like, it's not choosing to do anything. And then if the machine breaks and hurts somebody, whose fault is it? Is it the guy that built the machine? Is it the guy that was running the machine? Is it the guy that wrote the protocols for the workplace to operate the machine? That all in itself becomes is sufficient without any appeal to a cabal of Brahmins to determine why this is difficult. The fact that I would agree with Moldbug, there is a caste of Brahmins like this, doesn't sufficiently explain the problem. Logos.
The other problem too is, I mean, it's not clear what in formalism would fix this problem, because all formalism would say is, well, whoever has power, come forth and show us you have power, right? The problem is, as he's pointing out, he wants to say that nobody wants to claim they have power, right? So because power has a negative association. But the other problem too is everybody feels constrained by somebody else. And so they would always say, well, I would have power if, is basically how they couch it, right? I have to get permission from such and such to do what I want to do. And the other person says, well, I have to get permissions from such and such to do what I want to do. And you have this whole circle of that going on, which makes it impossible for people to step forward. Now, the problem is, formalism says, well, we should abolish that system. It's like, well, there's no ethical should, so should's got to be really, really careful there. So they have to clarify and say something like, well, in order to mitigate political violence, we have to abolish the system and replace it with a more clarifying one. It's like, well, how do you abolish the system without resorting to political violence? First of all, you could wait for the system to collapse, but even if the system collapses, it's not clear that on the other side will immediately be a more clarifying one. You have to actually, like, from the ashes, put forth, I want a more clarifying system that looks like this against competitors and beat them. Beat them at what? Ostensibly violence. So even if all of Moldbug's concerns are correct here, it's not clear either A, how formalism solves a problem, or B, if formalism solves a problem, how it navigates the should in keeping its promise of less violence. It doesn't clear that it's capable of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. However, there are euphemisms for it. Perhaps the most common is responsibility. A good way to find the most powerful people in the U.S. is to find the most responsible people. No one in the U.S. is scheming for power. A lot of them seem to be working for change. No one in the U.S. is brainwashing the masses. A lot of them seem to be educating the public. No one in the U.S. is ruling the world. A lot of them seem to be making global policies. Having power means you have choice. Mandelstam's poem on Stalin comes to mind. He sticks out his finger. He alone goes bang. Stalin was certainly one of the most powerful men of the 20th century, if not in human history. Most of us think he was evil. He would probably disagree. But if Stalin had woken up one day and decided that yesterday he was evil, but today he would be good, by my definition of good, by definition he would have used his power to do good, to be, in other words, responsible. The New York Times is a paragon of responsible journalism. It, or at least its journalists, would like us to be concerned about global warming. We can tell this by the fact that they write many stories on the subject. Surely, if they didn't want us to think about the subject, it is within their personal discretion to avoid it. They don't. And since many people read the New York Times, many of us are concerned about global warming. But if these journalists were to wake up one day and decide that instead we should not be worrying about global warming, but about black crime or Iranian outrages or the menace of marijuana, they could write those stories instead. Granted, if they just turn on a dime this way, that might surprise us a little. It would probably work better if they gradually phased out the global warming and phased in the black crime. But at a bottomless choice in their direction, and since we have freedom of the press, no one can stop them. Let's say that to be a major vector of the polygon, you need two attributes. One, a vertex must have power. That is responsibility. Two, it must be protected from public opinion. That is insulated from politics. That is democracy. If you have one of these but not the other, you are at the best a minor vertex. The press, aka MSM, is a major vertex because, as we've seen, it has power and is doubly protected. First, no one elects the press. And second, if journalists were elected, they simply elect themselves since they pick the credible candidates. These would all be journalists by definition. See how nice this system is. The White House, customarily referred to as the president, is only a minor vertex. Its legal power is considerable, but its protection is lousy. It was in national news a few years ago when an open mic caught the president insulting a New York Times reporter. How often do you think that one goes the other way? The White House can challenge the Polygon's program on a few issues, which necessarily thus become high profile, but the Fourth Republic at any one time is doing thousands and thousands of things. Almost all of them are done the Polygon's way, and when they are not, it is deeply shocked and offended. So in general are the voters for obvious reasons, so is the strong reason to minimize these deviations. The Polygon might be defined as extended civil service. It consists of none of those who actually hold formal GS rank, but those whose position demands a sense of civic responsibility, real or fake. The major vertices of the Polygon, by my count, are the press, the universities, the judiciary, the Fed, and the banks. The Hill, congressional staff, the civil service proper, the NGOs, transnationals, the military, the Beltway bandits, defense and other contractors, and corporate holders of official monopolies such as intellectual property. I suppose this would make it an iron decagon, but the count starts to get a little fuzzy. Anyway, I will discuss some of these actors in later posts. I hope this has helped you clarify your perception of the strange and awful world we live in. Okay, again, so we're seeing that this is going to lead into the cathedral. The one thing that's, I think, interesting here is when Moldbug talks about how the mainstream media can change the focus. And, he says they should probably do it slowly, but if they do it rapidly, they can do that too. And I'm struck by the conversations you and I have had, Logos, about how we went from, Occupy Wall Street to BLM, and of course, that's exactly what happened. The news, the people that mattered, said that, well, we don't want a class war. That's terrible. So they stopped reporting on the Fed, the bank, debt, U.S. wars, and they started, talking about these identity issues, and they completely changed everything around. So now, obviously, Moldbug didn't foresee them being used in that way, but nonetheless, that's interesting. And then also, let's see, it must be protected from public opinion. Well, you see that. So he says here too, it must be protected from public opinion, that is insulated from politics, that is democracy. I mean, he says that that's what the press does now, but in like an autocracy, that's what the army used to do. And since they're doing really the same thing, then the Fourth Republic, as he calls it, isn't actually a democracy because it's being protected from one, which again goes back to my point that Chomsky brought up, I think it was in my last video, where you had a lot of these, managerial elites like McNamara and Lippmann who were like, yeah, we're going to have this managed democracy. And so, Logos.
Yeah, I guess my last criticism hasn't changed very much. I'm still struck by what his criticism exactly is here. Like, people know the press has power now. Back then, right? Ask people why the freedom of the press is important. Well, the press has a responsibility to kind of like report on what's going on. They are a check on institutions of power. People already know that if the government does bad stuff, the press tells us about it, and we can act on it. So the like this isn't some new major thing. I don't even think it's that new back in 2007.
No, Chomsky already did manufacturing consent.
Exactly. So we've already had this idea that the press was in power. And so I hesitate to find people that don't understand the power of the press. And so if people understand the power of the press, then the press, we know who's in charge in that sphere. One of the vertices of the Polygon, it's the press. And so it seems to be fairly formalist in that we know who has power and what they do with the power. They report on things the government does or other things, manipulate public opinion, and manufacture consent. So is the press formalist or not formal? It seems pretty formalist to me. So, but he seems to say that the press is somehow illegitimate because it's what protected against public concerns. Okay, but he's been saying that democracy and rule of the public is bad. In his first article, he said that New York should be ruled more like Dubai from the top down and not from the bottom up because it's impossible to run anything from the bottom up. So why would it be a concern that it's protected against public opinion? So if he's trying to criticize the press from his formalist perspective, I don't see how it's working. If he's trying to identify the press as a power center, it seems like a lot of people, even at the time, would have understood that. So I'm not sure how it's novel. I don't understand what he's getting at here.
Sure. Okay, political sanity in one easy step. May 13th, 2007. My reader is rapidly dwindling as they struggle to make sense of the bizarre, unhinged extremism that is the bread and butter of unqualified reservations. Ask, how can we return to sanity? If democracy is nonsense, the modern equivalent of the Holy Trinity, a metaphysical cathedral so baroque and absurd it befuddles its own ministers. Larison is good today. Which is sense? Is there any read at all for us to cling to? Here is my red pill for today. Government is an organization of men and women. It is a group of individuals acting together to achieve a common purpose. Like any group or individual, its actions may be good or bad. Each of us has our own definition of good and evil. We can use the moral sense to judge the actions of governments just as we judge any group of individuals. Any group or individual. A good person is a person who does good things, and a good corporation is a corporation that does good things. A good government is a government that does good things. An evil government is a government that does evil things, etc., etc., etc. A government is not a mystic trust of God. It is not a repository of our fears and hopes. It is not the community. It is not the country. It is not the people. There is no such thing as self-government. Government is an organization that acts. So is Starbucks. Starbucks is not a democracy. It doesn't even pretend to be a democracy. It reports to a CEO who reports to its board, who reports to its shareholders. But if Starbucks were organized exactly in the same way as the U.S. federal government, if it had elections every 4 years in which all the customers voted, would you describe your Starbucks as a self-coffee? And if you think there's espresso, it's an over-extracted now? Because governments are sovereign by definition, and there is no external constraint on their actions. The problem of designing an effective government, one whose actions its customers consider good, is a very hard problem. Many writers, much smarter than me, have attacked this problem. Most of them have failed. Perhaps all of them have failed. But this problem is not a moral problem. It is an engineering problem. The moral aspect of government begins and ends with the definition of good. And specifically, good government is only meaningful to the actual customers of that specific government. I may feel Starbucks over-extracts its espresso, but if I give my espresso at Pete's, there's no reason for my opinion to matter. Similarly, what San Franciscans consider good government is not relevant to the municipal administration of Kandahar. Therefore, the question of whether A, liberal democracy, or B, divine right monarchy, or C, people's democracy, or D, formalism, or E, some other design, is the most effective way to constitute a government whose customers will consider it good is not a moral or spiritual question. It is a fact of empirical questions. Its answer may even be different for different groups of people. Moreover, when answering this question, we have to take into account the fact that liberal democracy is the design of government we live under. Of course, we think the answer is A. If we didn't think the answer was A, the Fourth Republic would not survive for a millisecond. It has taught us to believe the answer is A. But is the answer A? Obviously, I don't think so. But I could be wrong. My point is not that since everyone thinks the answer is A, the answer must be D. My point is that answering the question reasonably and independently without reference to what the Fourth Republic wants us to think is a serious and difficult task. It is very easy, for example, for us to conclude that the answer is not C, but this is because we don't live in a people's democracy. Victor Klemper, who was a better man than any of us, wound up serving as deputy of the East German Parliament. If you think it's easy to question received assumptions, try the last volume of his diaries. He constantly oscillates between doubt and belief. Sanity is not easy. Unless, of course, you take my red pill. Also, feel free to sell all your possessions, save your head, and join my fast-growing army of fanatical orange-robed disciples. I mean, this is all going to get back to the key paragraph here, which is wrong. But this is not a moral problem. It's an engineering problem. The moral aspect of government begins and ends with your definition of good. It's not an engineering problem. Because, again, in fact, arguably, what's causing the ambiguity in politics and in society as a whole is engineering itself. These people constructing ever new, more complicated material conditions that then force upon us new social conditions in order to effectively operate in. And then at different levels of the production chain itself, whether you're getting resources out of the ground, packaging it in an Amazon warehouse, or, running the, robot factories that design them, you're going to all have different sets of expectations there. But all of that is imposed by, wait for it, engineering, because it's the engineers that build those things for the demand of the technocracy and the corporate elites. So first of all, that's the driving reason why we have all this confusion and why we just can't let things be. But then second of all, this is a different kind of engineering than, say, the Romans. I mean, the Romans could build a bridge that lasts, 1,000 years because things weren't changing as much. But again, politics is, we mentioned in the very first episode, logos, people living in the city, the polis, which is Aristotle. All human interactions are in some sense political. And because of that, you're going to have, if we're going to use a quote, scientific term, then the solution is psychology, not engineering. Logos.
This might come as a shocker, but I'm confused again. So
Go ahead.
yeah, let's start listing the ways in which I'm confused by all this. So where do I want to start here? Okay, let's start with it's not a moral problem. It's an engineering problem. I think it kind of is a moral problem in the sense that he's already admitted that there's some minimal idea of progress, right? And as he said in his article about historical progress, um, Babylon fell, right? So whatever else you want to say about Babylon, it doesn't exist anymore. So there's certainly an idea of decay or degeneration in a society that could cause it to fail to exist. Um, Whatever else you want to say about goodness, let's suppose we could agree, as Moldbug seemed to implicitly agree in his other article, that um, a society that exists is better than a society that doesn't exist, all things equal. So you got the same group of people, right? Because as Moldbug himself would say, absent a society, uh, there's just going to be questions about who's in charge. It's anarchy, it's violence, it's power struggles, it's all that good stuff. So insofar as Moldbug wants explicit power structures, insofar as Moldbug wants the rule of law and so forth, then the government isn't just like beholden to its shareholders in terms of like what good is or its customers or whatever you want to say. The government has to strive for some idea of good by which it can maintain power, maintain the rule of law, and project that into the future. You have to have the stability to understand that. And I think that's a basic level in which I agree with Moldbug's formalist model. I just disagree with the rest of his formalist model because it's just kind of incoherent to me. But at least we agree on that small kernel that you want a government that can project some semblance of stability from one generation to the next, so people can feel confident raising their children and so on. Um, so good isn't just what your customers want. Good, at minimum, has to have that, whether your customers want it or not. Why is that relevant? Well, because he just said in his previous article that when technology gets so good and when lives get so good, people might just play Xbox on TV. They might not engage in society. They might do all sorts of crazy things because technology allows them to do it. Well, guess what then? What your customers want at a certain level of technology might be at odds with what you need to happen as a government to maintain a functioning society. So that fails, right? If it's just an empirical question of what your customers want, it fails because that's how you get a degenerative society that you just allow to degenerate because you don't do anything to change it. Well, in order to impose on the polis, you have to have a moral mandate. You have to convince them of that moral mandate, or you just have to win through violence. Well, okay, well, that's a problem for him because he doesn't want violence. But what if you can't convince them? Well, if you can't convince them, so now we're at a dilemma, right? This is where it gets really nasty, right? He's in a dilemma. If government fails to maintain, you get a power vacuum, anarchy, and violence. So government must maintain. In order to maintain, it has to mandate a minimal level of moral impositions on the populace to make sure they continue taking part in society in productive ways. If the populace doesn't agree, you get violence. If the populace can agree, great. Um, but not everybody's going to agree. So you're going to have to impose some kind of violence on some people who disagree somewhere. Or you get the ultimate power vacuum of violence. It's violence for some people, either direction of the pincer you go. And so that's a problem. And I think he knows this problem, which is why he's trying to obfuscate this idea of the good and just say, well, we'll just treat it like a CEO customer relationship. But in his previous articles, we know we can't do that. So that's roughly why I'm confused with that. I was probably confused about other things, but I think that's going to cut it for now because it's a mess.
It is a mess. Is anyone else getting a blogger error May 13th, 2007? Like BX-XQTSU or whatever, not always, but intermittently when trying to open this blog. Perhaps the foul meanings of the Fourth Republic are already on my trail. Okay. Probably just down for a day. Not a big deal. Secularists for Secularism, May 13th, 2007. The Dark Lord is simply on fire today. So he was linking to the American Conservative. So we're not going to read that. He's just telling you to read an article. Okay. Idealism is not great. May 14th, 2007. Well, the first thing I'll say is he's clearly riffing off of Daniel Dennett. God is not great. So he's putting idealism in the place of God for some sort of, debunking So we'll see what this looks like. I have a standard offer of bottle of Lafarge for anyone who can supply me with an objective and non-trivial explanation of any distinction between the nouns idealist and ideologue as used in the contemporary English language. Explaining that conservative ideologues are a dime a dozen, as are progressive idealists, but these are somewhat fewer progressive ideologues, and it is almost impossible to find a conservative idealist. Even when you really need one, will not get you the whiskey. However, there's another meaning of idealism in English, a historical one. Idealism is actually a philosophical school, or rather a number of philosophical schools. I find the term most useful as it pertains to the line from Plato to Hegel to Emerson to Dewey. It sometimes helps if you think of them as evil kung fu masters. Let's capitalize the word idealist in this sense so that we know we don't just mean a nice person who thinks the world can be improved. An idealist is a person who believes that universals exist independently. I don't like where this is going, Logos.
It already starts off really terrible.
Yeah,
really terrible.
We can't comment yet. We got to keep reading to see what the punchline is. Specifically, in the modern sense, your idealist believes in concepts such as democracy, the environment, peace, freedom, human rights, equality, justice, etc., etc. What do these concepts have in common? One, they have universally positive associations. In fact, they have no meaning without these associations. A statement such as the environment is evil or we must work together against the environment is simply not well formed. It is the equivalent of Chomsky's colorful green ideas sleep furiously. Two, they are impossible to precisely define. It's fairly clear that they have no meaning at all. For example, John Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice, which purports to be a rigorous, rational defense of the New Deal regime. The fact that this work appeared in the 1970s, whereas the coup it exists to excuse occurred in the 1930s, should clue you in to the difficulty of Rawls' masterful performance. Of course, the justice that Rawls so elaborately elucidates has nothing at all to do with the original English meaning of the word justice. As its Latin basis, that is the accurate application of the law, Rawls' ideal is probably best given in pre-Rawlsian English as righteousness. But it would be rather hard to call a book a theory of righteousness without provoking at least a snicker or two. We all know there is no objective definition of righteousness, and in fact, if anyone can go through the Federal Register or the Red Pen and explain which of these wonderful regulations are and are not just, according to Rawls' theory, he or she may earn that bottle of Lafarge after all. Just a page or two will do to demonstrate the method. The case of the environment is similar. We all know sort of what the environment is supposed to be, but as with justice, we don't have anything like a precise, objectively applicable rule for defining whether some action is good or bad for the environment. For example, if we sell Golden Gate Park to Halliburton as a combination condo subdivision and oil service theme park and give the resulting $90 billion to the Wilderness Society so they can buy an entire island of Borneo and preserve it as an orangutan habitat forever, is this good or bad for the environment? Discuss. This bizarre system of thought, which I hear actually earn a mention in the DSM-V, it's also entirely incapable of advising us on what to do with the ideals conflict. For example, suppose some action implies the environment but diminishes justice or vice versa. If this is a good action or bad, discuss. Okay, so let's go back to the first problem. Idealism and idealist. So before I continued reading, I immediately thought of the school of philosophy as well. Now let's look at Plato to Hegel. I don't know if you can draw a line from Plato to Dewey, maybe. But here's the thing. Where does he say this? Where did he say? He says that it's universal. Hold on. There we go. An idealist is a person who believes that universals exist independently. No. No, because substance dualists can also believe that universals exist independently. An idealist is someone who believes that everything is mental. So, for example, you could be an idealist who believes everything is mental and believe in universals independent of one's mind. One could also be a substance dualist, like, say, Thomas Aquinas, and believe that universals exist independent of one's mind as well. So okay, what do you do with that, Logos?
It sounds like his problem is with dualism, not idealism. I mean, idealism is about the ontology of substances, right? So there's monism, where there's only one type of substance that exists. There's dualism, where there's two types of substances that exist. So monism could be, in materialism, or it could be idealism. Obviously, a materialist isn't going to think there's some, justice or whatever that exists out there. But the thing is, idealism as a monist philosophy probably wouldn't either, right? So they'd say something like, the world is a product of either a mind that, precludes all of our minds, or it's a combination of all of our minds. And so, like, justice, whatever justice, there is no like justice independent from some things mental consideration of justice, whether it's God's consideration of justice or like our aggregate mental consideration of justice or something. Like, everything that exists is like some aggregate mental function. Everything's ultimately mind, somebody's mind. So calling it idealism is bad. If he wants to emphasize independent existence from reality, then he has to be talking about dualism. Um, so you'd have these universals that exist like independent of physical objects. The problem there is his criticisms don't really nail down um, dualism either. So, for example, Plato would have some of the same concerns that he does. See the Euthyphro dilemma, for example. For Plato, piety may be something that exists out in the ether, and maybe we can try to like have some system of ethics that approaches piety. But if one god prefers X and another god prefers Y, how would you reconcile those two differences? And that's where you get the Euthyphro dilemma. Do we pick what we if we want to aggregate this into a single ethical function? Did we pick this because the gods consider these things good, or because ultimately we do? If you want to like take a brash tax with it, um, and that's where it's going to come into play with his question of, say, justice versus the environment, right? Let's consider justice as a polytheistic god of something, and then there's some god of the environment, right? They have different commandments. How are you going to resolve one versus another one? You're going to get an equal Euthyphro dilemma either way. So to say that Plato is anyway the fault of this is, I think, to fundamentally misunderstand Plato. Plato preempted this problem long before he did, the goofball. Um, I don't understand the other parts either. It's not so clear to me that Hegel needs dualism, but maybe I need to read more Hegel. It seems to me that Hegel could be fine even under a materialist school of philosophy. And a good way to think about Hegel would be to think of like humans and chimps. He said earlier that humans and chimps have something in common, so not all behavior is necessarily learned. Maybe. Um, but if you want to take like a Hegelian approach to it, maybe humans and chimps develop the same behavior because they're trying to solve the same kind of problems. And so you have your synthesis, the actions available to you, the antithesis, the problems you're trying to solve. No, thesis, what's available to you, antithesis, the problems you're trying to solve. Synthesis would be the optimal strategies over the long run you generate for solving certain kinds of problems. You can then analyze with like game theory or something else. You can cash it out completely in materialistic terms, as say Marx might have done, or even Veblen. So I don't understand why Hegel inherits this line of thought from Plato if dualism and abstracta existing independently is the problem. I don't know where he's going with that. The other ones just get more and more weird. I don't know who these people are. I know they're roughly political philosophers. He has some political axe to grind, but he's completely lost a philosophical plot before them, and probably gets worse after them. So I don't even know what else to say about that. I'll let you respond to
Sure.
that.
Well, no, I mean, I'll keep reading. I'm sure we can come to some sort of conclusion. Idealists also recognize what might be called anti-ideals. These are just like the above ideas, except that instead of being good, they are actually bad. They have names like violence, inequality, racism, and so on. One interesting quirk of idealistic thinking is that while ideas are typically used only as objects in the strange sentences these people form, such as "we must preserve the environment," the anti-ideals can be subjects such as "violence kills 13 people in Iraq on Sunday." Apparently, this sort of universal not only exists independently, but buys explosives and plants them in dead goats, a remarkable feat for any concept. A little while ago, I explained that religion, if we define it as a system of belief involving anthropomorphic paranormal entities, cannot directly affect reality. A belief about the paranormal world can be the ultimate motivation for an action in the real world, but it cannot be the proximate motivation for an action in the real world. A long string of recent books by very distinguished thinkers such as Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett have basically informed us that religion is basically evil. That is, at the optimum level of religion in society, like the optimum level of mercury in your milk, 0. Since I have no belief about this paranormal plane myself, I am actually quite sympathetic to these volumes. Well, no, right, Logos, if you don't believe in the paranormal plane, that is a belief about the paranormal plane. I don't
Right.
know. What do you want to say here, Logos?
I don't think there's I the thing that struck out to me in what you read is scroll up a little bit. Let's see. Ideals also recognize anti-ideals. Yep. Oh, here we go. Apparently, they're sort of universal, not only exists independently, but buys explosives and plants them in dead goats. Well, hold on. Does it exist independent of physical reality or doesn't it? If it exists independent of physical reality, then by definition, it doesn't do the things he's accusing it of doing, right?
Yeah.
So I think he is really confused. So the problem then isn't even dualism because he's complaining about the way that people think that universals interact with reality or archetypes interact with reality. So really his argument is an Aristotelian one, not a Platonist one, because um Plato would say that we observe things in the world and then we look at the things we observe as special cases and try to glean what a general case might be like out there in Platonic heaven somewhere. And I think that Plato was kind of a precursor to modal logic. Imagine a possible world in which what we observe as this interaction might follow different rules somewhere else besides us. That would truly be independent because what we think about in that possible world has no bearing on like the hard constraints of our environment in this one. What he's talking about are philosophical views that nature has a telos, it has a way of being, and the archetypes basically inform the nature's telos. So now we're getting to something like Aristotle, or we're getting to something like somewhere else. And so when you're talking about justice, you're talking about a natural way of human flourishing. And so justice is something that we are supposed to approach in the real world. It's kind of like a quasi hylomorphism. And now that connection between Aristotle to Hegel makes some sense because I can kind of think of the Hegelian dialectic as a quasi, and I know I'm totally bastardizing this. This is not meant to be like one to one at all. It's kind of similar to like a Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, analysis, because you have like material cause, formal cause, and they come together to make like the thing in itself. He's talking about formal causes of nature and how we think that we should act on formal causes in nature to produce better outcomes. So this is his beef is with Aristotle, not Plato. So I think that makes a little bit more sense. But then it's an actual cause of a state of affairs. It's not independent of the state of affairs. And so he needs to clean up his philosophical vocabulary. But I think I now know what he's trying to say.
Okay. However, consider the form of such a book. Typically, it is a list of great historical crimes together with the explanations of how religion was the ultimate cause of such and such a crime. Naturally, after reading such a book, one feels slightly jaundiced towards religion, but of course, an argument of this sort, even if all of its history is perfectly correct, which it usually is. Wow, that really is hard to explain why he's got such a Catholic following. My goodness. That's going to be, well, I think I can explain it, and I will at the end. Goes nowhere at all towards convincing any reasonable person that religion is some unique peril. For example, one could assemble a similar book consisting entirely of crimes by Jews, or Norwegians, or Inuit, or Buddhists, or brown haired people, or any non trivial set of humans, past and present. Even if such a text made no connection at all between the Inuit upbringing of the criminals it rightly condemned and the fact that their victims were so often found with gaping harpoon wounds, the reader would probably infer one and come to the conclusion that the Inuit criminals should have their children confiscated and sent to special education centers where they learn only love for the walrus and for the whale. The inductive method, in other words, is simply not applicable to the task of discovering essential criminality in philosophies or traditions. But since philosophies and traditions, whatever their criminal or non-criminal nature, do not seem to have a suspicious involvement in the tremendous mayhem of history, perhaps it's worth looking around for another culprit. My hypothesis, which as any brave commentator is welcome to take a whack at, is that whether or not religion is the ultimate cause, the proximate cause of mayhem is generally idealism. That is when there is a problem with religion in a general way. The problem happens is that religion leads to idealism and idealism leads to mayhem. But since idealism is perfectly capable of existing without religion, since, for example, most of your recent mayhem has been the result of non-liberal idealist movements such as NS and Marxist-Leninists, oh boy, I got a lot to say about that. Perhaps Mazars, Dawkins, Hitchens, etc., with all due respect, are chasing the tail and ignoring the dog. In fact, if the type of idealism that is caused by religion is actually milder and less murderous than the non-theistic variants, a hypothesis that's not at all improbable considering modern history. Attenuating religion may actually promote mayhem. Obviously, this is a desperate plea for Andrew Sullivan to the link again. Perhaps this week we'll look a little more closely at some of these murderous idealisms. The idea that you call Marxist idealism does show you have no idea what you're talking about. Marxist literature is replete with attacks on idealism as representative of a deviationist Hegelian reading. So, literally, Marxism is the opposite of idealism in the philosophical sense that Moldbug appealed to at the very beginning. You can read Lenin and Mao all condemning idealism. So, that's just pitifully bad. Pitifully bad. The other thing is, if religion doesn't do anything because it's not real, then it's not something relevant to talk about. The real question that a materialist ought to answer is, what is the true underlying motivation? Since religion isn't one at all, because religion isn't a thing according to this, right? Also, you could sort of see the implicit. It's almost like Hopian-esque, where he just like has this word salad of like Jews, Norwegians, Inuits, Buddhists, brown-haired people. You can see that like in how Hoppe writes with like Democracy, the God That Failed. And he has that really interesting swipe, well, at religion generally, when he says that the arguments of the new atheists are broadly correct about history. Wow. I mean, I got nothing more to say on this. I've already talked about that at length in other videos. But here's the riddle. Why do so many Catholics and otherwise right-wing people like Moldbug? And I think it's this. Even though Moldbug says he's a Brahmin, even though Moldbug says he's a liberal, even though Moldbug says, Vaisias know your place because you're not very smart, and even though he agrees that Dawkins and Hitchens are basically right, he's talking computer code. He's talking tech speak. And a lot of these people either A, are in tech as digital programmers, B, are engineers, which is close enough, and C, are self-employed petite bourgeoisie. So they all have a similar class interest to Moldbug. And Moldbug is speaking their class interest language. And so despite all of these otherwise incongruous, incompatible statements about religion and Catholics and conservatives, people like that from a certain class perspective are drawn to Moldbug. And it's because Moldbug is so opaque, contrary to his protestations, it allows them to fill the void with their own beliefs, whether it's traditional Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy or neo-paganism, etc. Logos.
I don't got much to add to that. I mean, after clarifying this, it really does seem like he's taking a swipe at Aristotle more than anybody else. And so it's doubly surprising that like Catholics, especially Thomist-leaning ones, like Moldbug, because when Moldbug talks about like the environment, he talks about, whatever. Note that like for like Aristotelian Thomist type Catholics, the good, telos, is like the ultimate manifestation of all these things, right? And so we can think of like conditional virtues and apply to the good. So what is the good we should do for the environment in order to maintain human flourishing? Oh, well, that would be what's good for the environment, right? It seems like Moldbug's ultimately taking a dig at the good as their philosophical like idea. And so if that falls, the privation view of evil falls because there is no good for evil to merely be the absence of. All sorts of things immediately start falling with it like dominoes. And so I agree with you. I'm kind of befuddled that so many like Thomistic leaning Catholics that I've heard of actually like this guy, because he just takes a swings at all the foundations of their philosophy and they just seem to, I don't know, ignore it or what. I mean, I don't know what they expect to be built from the ashes, like if he gets away with it. So, I mean, are they just like closet Stirnerites in denial? I don't know what's going on.
What do you think about my explanation?
Yeah, class interests. I think in part that's right. I think another part is that he's one of the few that actually calls out the media as an institution. So many of like the National Review conservatives and whatnot, especially in the early 2000s, were in on the media establishment. There's like the neocon left wing kind of like agree to disagree kind of battle that still like carved up the nation. And if Moldbug's one of the few on the sideline saying like the media itself is out to get you, which is kind of like a pre-Trumpian idea. Um, a proto-Trumpian idea, let's say, I could see why they'd like him instantly for that reason. So when he describes politics, I think he's good, and people like him enough for his description of politics, and they just They just, I guess, deal with or ignore his more philosophical considerations. But the problem is, worldviews like his are built off philosophical considerations, whether he likes it or not. And so him being right on politics, but wrong on the philosophy means that, okay, he's great at gainsaying or doomsaying about society, but what he want instead is terrible if they just connect the dots. So I don't know.
Well, let me add a little bit more to my explanation, given what you just said. So let's say that this petite bourgeoisie class, computer programmers, engineers, and self-employed, and Moldbug is sort of speaking in that class language. They might then say, well, the real reason why Moldbug is right is not because of his quote metaphysics, which they would otherwise object to, but because of A, his position within the tech economy, giving him certain insights, and then B, his framing of everything as engineering problem, in which case, well, they would all be like, yeah, we already agree with that. And then they'd say, well, but we give a better ideological underpinning to this engineering project. So we agree with the overall project, but we disagree with Moldbug's foundation, and they just insert theirs in as if it's not a big deal.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, the problem is all Moldbug's arguments so far have seemed to hinge on the no moralizing assumption about politics. But the second they try to usurp Moldbug's non-moralizing engineering for their more moralistic engineering involving things like the good or other things like that, um, they'll have knocked over one of Moldbug's core assumptions. And so all the arguments that they would have agreed with Moldbug made based on that assumption now fall because their assumption is gone. So once you go back full circle, it'll be tough to see like how they actually agreed with Moldbug if they were going to undermine one of his core assumptions in the end. Like, what do they agree with him on?
I mean, that's a good point. But here we're going to take a brief break, and Logos and I should be back within 5 minutes. Okay, we're all back, guys. Back to the regularly scheduled programming. The Lafrage is unrewarded, May 15th, 2007. Thanks, however, to all those who have given it a shot. The bile remains, mostly, and the contest continues. But I amend the prize requirement to include the additional test, as is discussed in my comments below. See inserted C. Of the first half hour of Zabriskie Point. Are these folks ideologies, idealists, neither or both? No entry will be considered without response to this important consideration. However, I have a new contest involving a certain book I bought today. It is the boxed edition from 1971, published by Knopf, with a book design that's frankly beautiful of a work that originally appeared on 64. There's nothing so undignified as a blurb on the box, and on the foot jacket itself there's only one blurb, which appears on the front cover, the back cover being simply blank in a very attractive off-white linen. The blurb on the front reads, "The noblest self-disclosure of spiritual struggle and triumph, perhaps the greatest testament of personal devotion published in this century." This remarkable encomium is attributed with a grand and not un-Catholic simplicity to the New York Times Book Review. There are two ways to win. One, you can identify the book and or author. Oh, okay. Well, I'll keep reading it. This isn't much here. Please answer only if you know the answer. I'm interested only in guesses, not research. Second, you can find another book with a better blurb than this. Any book of any kind will do. But please consider both the text of the benediction and the authenticity of the benedictor. Fortunately, since the last contest was, I believe, on the order of rhyming orange, whereas this one can actually be won, the victor or victors are no more than a shot of Lafrage, or in case of a remarkable effort, possibly a double. Professor Moldbug's resources are limited. Okay, so nothing to say here. URL's plan to fix Iraq. May 16th, 2007. It's all very well fixing the world in theory. It would be nice, however, if someone would fix it in practice. Obviously, the place to start is its most screwed up place we can find. Iraq? I don't know. Wouldn't you pick Afghanistan? But whatever. Therefore, please allow me to present Unqualified Reservations' one-page plan for Iraq. The goal of this plan is to convert Iraq into the most prosperous and stable region in the world. The primary obstacle is the weather, which will still suck. Anyone with thoughts on Mesopotamian climate mitigation should forward them immediately to my attention. First, we need to deal with the Iraqi Kurdistan. The U.S. will recognize the Kurdistan regional government within its present de facto borders and formally commit itself to non-intervention in any dispute between Kurdistan and Turkey. This leaves 15 Ottoman-era provinces, or vilayets. The U.S. will abolish the so-called nation of Iraq, default on its debts, and privatize the vilayets with their present borders, converting them to independent emirates governed by publicly traded sovereign security companies. These SSCs will be the sovereign governments of the new emirates of Mesopotamia. They will be responsible for all internal security within their territories. The U.S. will guarantee their external security against foreign invasion for a period of 10 years. In return, they will agree not to convert themselves into Al-Qaeda theme parks. The SSCs will be publicly traded corporations listed in Dubai. Their shares will be divided into two classes of equal size, A and B. All profits the SSCs produce will be returned to all shareholders equally, but B shares have voting rights, whereas A shares do not. In 25 years, all A shares convert to B shares. B shares will be sold in Dutch auction in Dubai, providing the capital isn't for the SSCs. A shares will be allocated uniformly among all persons now living who were born in Iraq, including Kurdistan, and who give or whose guardians gives their word of honor to support the new system of government. All Iraqis will be allocated shares of all emirates without regard to their current residence, whether in Iraq or elsewhere. A shares are not citizenships. They are fully transferable. They confer no rights except for the dividends they receive, and no more will be issued. The SSCs, since the emirates will be their own assets, can be expected to govern them stably and effectively, much as the UAE, Dubai, and its neighbors are governed. The difference is that public ownership rather than family ownership is a much stabler and more effective system for governing a large corporation. As a result, we should expect the Iraqi Emirates to be even more efficiently governed than the UAE, which is already quite peaceful and prosperous. The first attack of the SSCs will be suppressing all violence and other organized political activity in the Emirates. They will abolish all gangs, parties, mafias, militias, liberation fronts, revolutionary brigades, and other murderous detritus of the democratic period. Under the SSCs, the business of Iraq will be business, just as in Dubai. Or we could just get the hell out and let the place turn into Mad Max, the documentary, or we could keep using it as a sort of live fire training range to create a battle hardened army, perhaps the principal unrecognized advantage of occupying Iraq. I'm sure that by some definition of ethics, there are also ethical options. One thing that's interesting here is this is where at least the monarchy bros are not fully in alignment with Moldbug, because he says it's more stable and efficient than the UAE, which is governed by a monarchy. But the other thing is, I mean, granted, we have hindsight, but this is basically just the ANA in Afghanistan, and it would have failed day one, just like the ANA failed day one. Well, okay, not using hindsight, this would basically be the South Vietnamese army that failed as soon as the U.S. left. Logos, any thoughts on this?
This is more your wheelhouse than mine, so no.
Right. Okay. Well, it sounds like it would. It's hard to tell if Moldbug is giving us a perspective that he knows wouldn't work in order just to tweak people, because that is a thing he does. Okay. Our planet is infested with pseudo-atheists, May 16th, 2007. The other day, I defined idealism as a belief in a mysterious universals. I noted that while this pernicious trait appears both in religious, paranormal, and secular non-paranormal belief systems, these days it's much more common in the latter, and I suggest that this may be something to do with the monstrous violence of the Enlightenment era. For example, there is no way to distinguish someone who worships the environment from someone who venerates the great god Pan. In the real world, the two will act identically. Indeed, it's easier to reason with the Pan worshipper when he tells you that he needs to save the rainforest because the rainforest is sacred to Pan. The conversation to a Pan skeptic such as myself is over. Both sides can see there's no common point of reference, and the two of you can start working out how to agree to disagree. Whereas when the environmentalist worshiper tells you about the biodiversity of the rainforest, she has created an endless hairball of arguments which trail off into nonsense everywhere. What exactly is biodiversity, and why is it important? What does lungs of the planet mean? Does the planet have a liver too? And if so, where is it? Idealism without holy books is a permanent fountain of conversation, a gold mine for the sophist case. The danger of idealism is that it is a form of rationalism. Wow. No. We'll get into that later.
Wow. It just gets worse.
Rationalism is the assertion that one's perceived beliefs are products of pure reason. In fact, rationalism is to reason as scientism is to science. Here at UR, we believe in reason too, but we like to work our beliefs out for ourselves. Regular leaders may have noticed that we have been getting very different results. Okay, stopping here. No, it's literally the exact opposite. Modern rationalism, we could say, begins with Descartes and Spinoza, and they were very much opposed to the idealists like Bishop Berkeley and Hegel. And I mean, what do you want to say at this point, Logos?
Well, as we just discussed earlier, his notion of idealism is like a quasi-Aristotelianism, where you have these formal causes which are not materially constituted, but still affect the material world, and affect the material world in things that we are morally incentivized to adhere to. So there is some kind of form of goodness in flourishing that interacts with humanity in such a way that humanity should organize our behaviors to maximize flourishing or whatever. So he's not getting at the philosophical idea of idealism, but to say that Aristotelianism is a form of rationalism is kind of interesting, because Aristotelian universals, the kind that actually impact the real world, rely on at least one kind of thing existing before you can universalize about it. There's no universal tree unless you've seen at least one tree. Making it a kind of hybrid of like rationalism and empiricism. It's certainly not fully rationalist. Um, a rationalist might be a kind of Socratic, definitely a Platonist, because Plato thought you could, remember everything by recollection, everything important anyway. And so that'd be a kind of rationalism where it's all about asking the right questions and reasoning foundationally to like get to certain conclusions. But at that point, the universals that you are accessing through your memories and whatnot aren't interacting in the world in the way that would worry him about his type of idealism. So again, he's kind of like conflating all these different philosophies and scapegoating the wrong ones. So idealism and rationalism aren't related, but this will get to his idea of rationalism. Rationalism is the assertion that one's received beliefs are products of pure reason. Well, that's not true. Rationalism would just say that one's received beliefs aren't empirical, right? That's the point. Is it, again, like monism versus dualism? Monism would be like pure reason versus pure empiricism. And so rationalism would be like the pure antithesis of empiricism, as if to say that like none of our core beliefs are empirically obtained. Um, but I think he would also agree with that. He'd have to, because as he says, history isn't a science. You can't like empirically like tear down and like reconstitute history like in a scientific method to figure out what like empiricism would say to do about history. You only got one shot, so you have what you have, and you're going to have intuitions about history that you're going to reason through. And those intuitions probably aren't the product of pure other empirical scientific trains of thought. So I don't know what exactly he's opposed to here. It doesn't seem like he or his readers are pure empiricists, and so they'd probably have more in common with the rationalists than not. So, um, yeah, this doesn't make a lot of sense.
Okay. Where were we? My stance on the world should be pretty clear by now. I think the West's replacement of Christianity with idealism was a disaster. In fact, since the roots of idealism in Protestant Christianity are so clear, well, we don't even know what idealism is. I'd like to know what he thinks Protestant Christianity is, because it'll probably be just as enlightening as his views on idealism. So does democracy and equity simply reek of pure Jesus? It's arguable that idealism is simply a fanatical strain of non-theistic Christianity, but the idea of non-theistic Christianity is hard for people to swallow, and it at least deserves its own post. So this is definitely more of a broadly neo-pagan critique that we'll see amongst the DR, that all of this goes back to Christianity. And we know that's what he's saying, because he says pure Jesus, which I don't have the time or the inclination right now to get into how all of Jesus' teachings don't really fit with the New Deal. But I'm sure I'll get to something like that a bit later on my channel at some point. In any case, it's clear that most people who describe themselves as non-believers are in fact idealists, often quite fanatical ones. Our planet is infested with pseudo-atheists. It's horrible. Okay, again, that's another Stirnerite dog whistle, because Stirner says that our atheists are the most pious people because they fight and serve for higher ideals. So again, that's another evidence that he's a Stirnerite. Most of the people who understand that we live in the idealist equivalent of a theocracy, an idiocracy, perhaps our paleo-conservatives and their intellectual recovery program tends to include a return to pre-idealist Christianity. But if this is all just Jesus talk, then there's no such thing as pre-idealist Christianity, unless pre-idealist Christianity isn't Christianity. So we'll see how that works out. Two very prospective paleos are Larry Astor and Daniel Larison, both of whose blogs I read every day. Perhaps it'd be horrified to hear, but there's a certain Voltairean flavor to their work of both these writers. As with most paleos, their writing is just refreshing. Every day, some bloated balloon of idealistic cant floats and yields its the musty guts to this clear, sharp pen. These gentlemen are the new philosophes, and I'm sure history will treat them as such. Unfortunately, I'm not a Christian. I have no faith. I simply don't see any reason to believe in the paranormal. And while I think the West would be much better placed if it returned to traditionalist Christianity, I don't think this can happen spontaneously, and I don't think it can be done by force, nor do I see any other possibilities. Christianity is either A true, or B untrue. There is no C. Since I believe it is B, a return to traditionalist Christianity from universalist idealism, what Astor calls liberalism, is not, in my opinion, a case of truth outcompeting fiction. Certainly one fiction cannot compete another. Public opinion is at root a matter of fashion. The world contains both fashionable fictions and unfashionable ones. The problem is that at present, all the fashionable people in the world, except for Techie, are idealists, and a very large percentage of the unfashionable ones are traditionalists. I find it simply impossible to imagine any reversal in this pattern, at least until traditionalist Christianity has been entirely or almost entirely extirpated by the idealists. This looks like it will take at least another 40 or 50 years. And at this point, what does traditionalism even mean? It became an invention, a fake, the equivalent of Ossian and Kwanzaa. I will pass over the revolting idea of reimposing Christianity by force. I'm sure it would work in a sense, because contrary to idealist doctrine, people can in fact be conquered and indoctrinated. But I don't think there's a paleo-conservative on the earth who would endorse it, even if they could imagine a way of making it happen. So again, other than being really bad on the historical facts, which again, you'll just have to take my word for that, Logos, and being kind of muddled, is there anything else you want to say?
I don't understand where the Protestant thing comes from. I could understand if he said Catholic Christianity, because Catholic Christianity leans Aristotelian, but the Protestants, I don't. I mean, if you go too far Protestant, you get Calvinist, right? And Calvinism would say all this idealist talk is stupid because whatever's going to happen is just what God wants to happen. Mind your business, keep your nose down, get to work, hope that God loves you in the end, basically. Hope you're the elect. And them's the breaks, right? So it seems like the more Protestant you get, the further you get away from what he's concerned about. Conversely, the more Catholic you get, the closer you get to what he's concerned about, because you have like entire Catholic schools that are all about like revolutionary theologies and things like this. They're very idealistic. So, I mean, aside from what we've already said, I'm not going to keep beating that horse. The particularity with Protestantism is baffling. I just don't get it.
Oh, it is baffling, as well as the fact that the Optimates are being WASPs are lineally descendant from the Puritans, and so the Puritans are the cause of the Brahmins, who are not actually WASPs, and the WASPs, who are Optimates, aren't Puritans. This is all just gobbledygook erasure. So we'll keep. Let's see. Okay, blah blah blah. Paleoconservatism, in my opinion, is a technical dead end in the struggle against idealist rule. It seems promising because it seems to offer a large body of supporters, traditionalist Christians who are relatively uncontaminated by idealist propaganda, and many of whom are hopping up and down with rage at the various insanities, absurdities, and atrocities they see perpetrated with such blithe self-confidence by the idealist fanatics who run the world. But the actual power of this power base has been diminishing for the last 250 years, and no one has managed to do anything useful with it for at least the last 100. Ought is not the same as is. That is why I prefer the Voltaire angle. I will do my damnedest to pop any balloon, idealist or Christian. I am an equal opportunity pin. It so happens that contrary to the river of insane paranoia, which the idealist press constantly pumps into our eyeballs, almost all real power in the world is held by idealists, so the really fat, juicy balloons are the idealist ones. But I hope my readers, all three of them, will not mistake this for some deference to Christianity. To me, the best scenario for getting rid of idealism is one in which, as has happened many times in history, both distant and recent, smart young people realize that their elders are pumping them full of premasticated tripe. I think the West needs an orange revolution. Just as a real quick, that's actually relevant to what we're going through now in Eastern Europe. The Orange Revolution was a quote-unquote non-violent revolution of election recall that got rid of the pro-Russian candidate in 2005 and replaced him with a pro-Western candidate in Ukraine. Therefore, the cultural trend I find most helpful is the appearance of youth-oriented and thoroughly fashionable outlets such as Vice and The Exile, which seem to have a less investment in idealism than, say, Vanity Fair. Well, that's not aged well
That did not age well at all.
Vice is just a complete dumpster fire for this. Oh, man, let's keep going. Perhaps someone can correct me, but I have no hesitation at all in saying that Vice is hipper than Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair, however, is definitely hipper than VDare, which is, so far as I know, has never published any horror stories. Thus, my reasoning on tactics. If any paleos care to correct my misconceptions, the comment section is open. One reader, George Weinberg, who has contributed many thoughtful comments to UR, and hopefully will contribute many more, suggests that non-idealism is too close to nihilism for his comfort. We are nihilists. We believe in nothing. Well, it might be that Moldbug is a Stirnerite, which is not that far from nihilism. So maybe George Weinberg is not wrong after all.
He's onto something.
I disagree. To me, non-idealism is nothing more than atheism, properly applied. Isn't that the same thing? It's my personal reaction to Chesterton's remarkable observation that when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. I agree with this observation. It matches my own. But I just think it takes work and attention to really believe in nothing, to be a reasonable person rather than a rational idealist. Again, this is classic Stirner, right? Moldbug is basically saying, don't believe in anything higher than yourself. Just believe in, power, which...
Yep.
To me, nihilism applies amorality. No, that's only added to that by the people who are attempting to slur that kind of behavior, like the nihilists in Russia, who were radical revolutionaries that wanted to topple the regime.
Even
And
so, even so, he wants an amoralist political system.
yeah, he does. It's not a tradition, it's an aspect of human biology. I cannot think of any human culture that has actually been amoral or anti-moral. The most murderous tend to be those that spend the most time obsessing about right and wrong. Therefore, I see nihilism as just another anti-ideal, a universal that can't be defined because it cannot exist in reality. In other words, it's an imaginary threat that seems suspiciously well adapted to hurt us back toward idealism. While I certainly would not endorse the entire oeuvre of David Stove in particular, I can't make head or tail of his anti-Darwinism. His famous piece, What is Wrong with Our Thoughts, does a great job of making the case against idealism. I'd certainly say non-idealism is a form of non-positivism Stove presents in his cute little rant. To me, what's so unfortunate about our contemporary version of idealism is that it's an almost perfect replacement of actual thought. Modern society is awesomely complex, but not entirely without structure and form. History is not deterministic, but it exhibits recurring patterns. Classifying these patterns, understanding the flow or cause and effect, distinguishing between vicious and virtuous cycles is a fascinating, difficult, and to me at least, endlessly entertaining task. In the place of this task, idealism gives us Kant. It's a little shrieking lizard monkey leaps up and tells us that democracy and the environment are good, inequality and racism are bad. It sometimes even finds a way of purveying this Kant that pass, at least to their authors, as humor. The entire idealist blogosphere considers itself hilarious. It also thinks of itself as the true and only successor to Rabelais, Voltaire, and Mark Twain. It's also very depressing. What's a non-idealist to do? I mean, of course, besides shaving your head, selling your possessions, and coming to live in my paramilitary literary commune, where the food is the only thing more boring than the incessant calisthenics, sonnet drills, and rifle practice. I mean, we've already mentioned the whole dumpster fire of his definition with idealism, so everything we're going to say is just downstream from that. The only thing the main thing I have to say is that Vice is not, well, it did change, admittedly, but okay. This is why he says it about Vice and Exile. These are basically up and coming tech news sites, and they're from his class, and he's representing the insurgent tech class against the, managerial Lippmann McNamara old liberal cast. And so he assumes, well, they're my cast, they must be good. But it turns out that once they, became wildly successful and influential between, say, 2010 and 2016, and they became the establishment, all of that cool, edgy stuff that he liked about them went away. Now, in this case, I say that you don't need hindsight to see that. That's what happens to a lot of these revolutionary movements. As soon as they take power, they stop being cool and edgy. Logos.
Yeah, so I'm confused again. So he says he can't be a nihilist because no society lives or acts purely amoralistically. But if that's true, that no society lives or acts amoralistically, how does he expect them to determine in a non-moralistic manner who should have power, who does have power, right? The central question for society is who controls it, who runs it, what does it do? And he expects us to be amoral on the core question of society while failing to be, by his own admission, amoral in any other regard, which is why there's no such thing in his eyes as true nihilism. If that's not him refuting his own system, I don't know what else he could say to refute his own system. I mean, at this point, I almost just want to just like wash my hands of this and say, okay, he just said his own system is impossible. We're done. We can call it a day. Like, how else? How much deeper can we let him dig his own hole here? He's already buried himself. He's dug it. He's buried himself. I mean, we can ask him to politely seal the coffin, perhaps, but I mean, this is done. It's over.
Yeah, because if you want to create a completely apolitical system, but then you say that 2 months later, that's absolutely impossible, well, then you just checkmated yourself, right?
Yeah, there's nothing more to say.
All right. The evidence of such sheer dishonesty in science was hard to accept. May 17th, 2007. I'm trying to take a small blog break today because I actually have a code to write. However, I do want to thank the godly Nick Zasbo for linking to me. I consider you are a bad imitation of Nick's blog, unenumerated, the main difference being that I post more often and Nick knows what he's talking about. If anyone feels giddy as a result of UR withdrawal, however, you can top off your pessimism tank with a quick hop to climate audit. Let's see. Don't miss the comments on this article where you will find beautiful and uplifting realizations. This is this one by Pat Frank. I remember back when you first posted on the truncation of Briffa 2000, Steve, and recall being unable to parse the meaning of it. My mind felt numb. In retrospect, my reaction came because the evidence of such sheer dishonesty in science was too hard to accept. After an adult lifetime of hewing to the principles of objectivity, to see the bedrock of science floated on that scale by institutional scientists was more than I could countenance. I've since become more hardened. Of course, Frank is an obvious denialist, probably a relative of Hans Frank. Not content with the rape of Poland and the mass murder of the Jews, these denialists are now ganging up to destroy the earth herself, congratulating on the notorious denialist hate site climate audit. I think a little denial of service attack might spoil their denialist Exxon fried lunch. Sorry, just participating for the upcoming launch of UR, the Coast Diary, my upcoming spin-off site. The success of Unqualified Reservations, another 5 hits yesterday, may be temporary, and I must move quickly to disseminate these important informations. Well, in light of the last 15 years, this is actually kind of apropos. Science is just a political football. It always was. Astronaut you mean science is a political football? Always was. It's only some delusional, self-serving, science man who wants to pay his, mortgage. Does he believe that it's the infallible 10 commandments off the mountain from Moses that nobody would dare to pollute with political preferences, right, Logos?
I think it's true for some science. I think, okay, here's where science gets off the hook. The less likely it is for a politician or a layman to understand science in order to derive political policy from it, the more removed from politics it probably is. So if you get into like theoretical, like quantum physics or like molecular physics or something like that, the stuff you find and deal with is probably not something that people are going to understand and try to make policy around. But if you get into like social sciences, people try to make policies about that all the time. Climate science, things of that nature. So like the closer you can make things like relatable, the more subject to politics is going to be for sure.
But even now, with what's happened with, Boghossian and who's the other guy that works with him?
You mean like James Lindsay and Pluggo?
Yeah, even that stuff is under attack now.
Even what now?
Well, even the quote unquote more hard sciences are under political attack now with what their reaction to the woke.
I would definitely say the education pipeline to get into those sciences is. I don't think the ideologues that would attack on those grounds can understand enough about the material for the most part to do any real damage to like the esoteric like papers that are written in the academy about those subjects. I think that's going to be the saving grace and bulwark against that. But what they are doing is they're writing article after article about like physics and STEM education in general, about how that's racist or whatever else, to try to get like those structures and institutions changed at the minimum.
Yeah. Okay. The Magic of Symmetric Sovereignty, May 19th, 2007. Readers who find all this political theory interesting, perhaps there are 4 or 5, may enjoy some of the debates I've been having with Nick Zasbo in the comments of these posts. It's always a pleasure to cross swords with the master, even when all you get is a ghastly facial wound. One of the issues, perhaps the main issue, that Nick and I differ on is sovereignty. Nick, like all other political thinkers, at least all those to the left of Attila the Hun, believe that sovereignty should be limited. That the sovereign has no right to infringe on the basic legal rights of citizens. My view is that the concept of limited sovereignty is self-contradictory and informalist. In fact, I think this limited sovereignty, of which popular sovereignty is one case, is one of the chief misconceptions in the Enlightenment political toolbox. This innocent and appealing idea, in my opinion, is substantially responsible for the appalling chaos of our era. Rather, I hold what Nick would call the totalitarian theory of sovereignty. While it's often fun to elaborate the pejorative, this is an awful big word to swallow. I think a better word is symmetric. That is, for my sovereign, property is just like any other. I define sovereignty as an independently secured, or in other words, primary property right. This is contrast to a dependently secured or secondary property right. The symmetric theory of sovereignty proposes that the same principle applies to both. The extent of the property right is defined by the actual power secured. Of course, I think this has the same result as Nick's totalitarian theory, but I think it sounds a lot nicer, don't you? Let's look at how the symmetric theory works out in practice. Okay, a lot of interesting things here. First of all, this seems to be, again, Moldbug saying, yes, Chomsky, I am the evil totalitarian you think capitalism will turn into. Because he basically says the rule of private property is totalitarian, which is exactly what Noam Chomsky said right around the same time. Well, it was a little bit later. I think Ron Paul was running for office, so 2008. The other thing that's interesting is that's not the definition of sovereignty I use, nor I think most people. So there's one definition of sovereignty that I think has been important is the Schmittian definition that it is the one who defines the exception. So the one who is sovereign is the one who gets to declare the state of emergency, which that's been popular even amongst the DR as a way of defining political sovereignty. And I think even when we talked about some of your questions you had about Christianity, I said that I would believe that's a definition of sovereignty that could also apply to God. So I just don't accept this kind of sovereignty definition for politics. Logos.
Well, I'm confused again because he defines sovereignty as an independently secured property right. Well, independent of what? That's the question. Independent of what? That's where the question's going to be begged, right? Because from what does the government draw its power to control the property it controls? Well, the consent of the governed is the usual model, right? The government doesn't just get to take property in a vacuum like you or I could homestead a forest. Government rules over property already dwelt in by people. So it's not like homesteading unhomesteaded land or anything like that. It's where people already are, which means by definition, its property is secondary because it has to get the permission of people who live on property to rule over the property they live in the sense that if they don't like what the government's doing, they can always revolt and put a stop to it. Well, they can attempt to, right? It certainly wouldn't be uncontested. And I think that's the point. The point is the sovereignty he's getting at in his definition seems to me to be an uncontestable kind of sovereignty. But governments are many things, but uncontestable is not one of them, which owes to Nick's point that Nick keeps debating with, is that governments have to tread lightly on legal rights. I wouldn't go that far as a Hobbesian. I just couch it in terms of expected utilities, but let's just use Nick's argument. The governments don't tread on legal rights because if they tread on the legal rights and make the citizens too angry, the citizens revoke consent for the government to rule over the property they already inhabit. And so Nick would say that government rights are secondary property rights to whoever's already on the land. I think this guy just kind of throws out words without like really considering their meaning, like idealist, independent. We talked about the forms being independent, or sorry, the universals being independent, but it describes them acting dependently with matter. But then he talks about independent cause. Sorry, what was that one? Independently secured. That's right. But it's actually dependent security because it's dependent on people who already live on property. Like, I don't know. He just makes these mistakes over and over again. It's kind of frustrating.
You do wonder how you get this far, don't you? Okay, let's see. Practice. So maybe this will help us out, Logos. In practice, imagine I'm a respectable white person who enunciates properly and is maybe a little portly, and I own a house in the suburbs. If a bunch of boys from the hood shows up with the Tech Nines and say, "Out you mofos, this is our house now," my first call will be to Officer Friendly, who will arrive in some kind of armored vehicle and enfilade the hoodlums. This means my property right is secondary, not primary. In a sense, all I really own is an agreement with the township of Whiteville to protect my house, which is my castle, against the depredations of these colorful and militant delinquents. In fact, in the primary sense, I really own nothing at all because Officer Friendly can just as easily confiscate the piece of paper that is my title, leaving me yelling in an undignified and pathetic way on the front lawn that used to be mine. So we see that the primary property is very different from secondary property. In fact, the number of primary properties in the world may have peaked around 1,500 years ago and have been decreasing for quite some time. If you follow the thinking of some internationalists, There is only one primary property in the world, the United Nations, all mere nations being secondary. Of course, if Bush decides he is really mustache man, these guys will be like on Rikers Island like that. So perhaps this model is a little simplistic. However, one way to evaluate a political design is to consider its worst possible result. That's Rawlsianism. Like, I thought this guy was against Rawlsianism, Logos.
Yeah, how are we evaluating worst possible result here? With respect to what moral framework are we evaluating a worst possible result? If it's worse for justice, but better for the environment, or better for justice, or worse for the environment, which result of those two is the worst result?
We'll see. Let's see, Logos. Let's see. The worst possible result of symmetric sovereignty is an evil dictator who takes over the world and decides to torture and murder everyone in it, replacing us with gesticulating, mustachioed clones. Okay, I'll admit this is not a desirable result unless I get to be the evil dictator, in which case I at least need to start working on my mustache. So let's modify this slightly and instead look for the worst possible rational result. That is, let's assume the dictator is not evil, but simply immoral, omnipotent, and avaricious.
Wait. Why would we do that?
Right, because morality is an engineering problem, bro.
Right. So how is he to say? Who is he to say that the dictator is evil? First off, and secondly, if the dictator thinks he's acting amorally, but Moldbug here disagrees, well, now we just have an impasse because the dictator does think he's being a good engineer. He also said earlier that the people who have power generally think they're doing the good anyway.
Yeah. All right. One easy way to construct this thought experiment is to imagine the dictator isn't even human. He's an alien. His name is Fnargle. Fnargle came to Earth for one thing, gold. His goal is to dominate the planet for thousands of years, the so-called thousand-year Fnarg, and then depart his Fnarg ship with as much gold as possible. Other than this, Fnargle has no other feelings. He's concerned with humans about the way you and I are concerned with bacteria. So basically, it's the Ferengi meets Mustache Man. That's kind of interesting. Very strange. You might think we humans, a plucky bunch, would say, screw you, Fnargle, and not give him any gold, but there are two problems with this. One, Fnargle is invulnerable. He cannot be harmed by any human weapon. Two, he has the power to kill any human or humans anywhere at any time just by snapping his fingers. Other than this, he has no other powers. Oh, other than being omnipotent, he has no other powers. Go figure. He can't even walk. He needs to be carried as if he's the Empress of India. Fnargle actually has a striking physical resemblance to Jabba the Hutt. But with invulnerability and the power of death, it's pretty simple matter for Fnargle to get himself set up as Secretary General of the United Nations. And the thousand-year Fnargle, the UN is no more sinecure for alcohol African kleptocrats. It's an absolute global superstate. Its only purpose is Fnargle's gold, and lots of it. In other words, Fnargle is a revenue maximizer. The question is, what are his policies? What does he order us? His loyal subjects, to do? The obvious option is to make us all slaves in gold mines, otherwise blam, instant death. Slacking off, I see. That's a demerit. Another 4, you know what happens. Now dig. Perhaps some readers have seen Blazing Saddles. But wait, this can't be right. Even mine slaves need to eat. Someone needs to make our porridge and our shovels, and actually we'll be a lot more productive if instead of shovels we use backhoes, and who makes those? And we quickly realized that the best way for Fnargle to maximize gold production is simply to run a normal human economy and tax it in gold. Natch. In other words, Fnargle has exactly the same goal as most human governments in history. His prosperity is the amount of gold he collects and tax, which has to be extracted in some way from the human economy. Taxation must depend in some way on the ability to pay, so the more prosperous we are, the more prosperous Fnargle is. Fnargle's interests, in fact, turn out to be oddly well aligned with ours. Anything that makes Fnargle richer has to make us richer and vice versa. For example, it's Fnargle's interest to run a fair and effective legal system because humans are more productive when their energies aren't going into squabbling with each other. It's even in Fnargle's interest to have a fair legal process that defines exactly what he will snap his fingers and stop your heart, because humans are more productive when they're not worried about dropping dead. And it's in his interest to run an orderly taxation system in which tax rates are known in advance if Fnargle doesn't seize whenever to feed his prodigious gold Jones, because humans are more productive when they can plan for the future. Of course, toward the end of the thousand-year Fnargle, this incentive will be diminished, but let's assume Fnargle has only just arrived. Other questions are easy to answer. For example, will Fnargle allow freedom of the press, but why wouldn't he? What could the press do to Fnargle? As Bismarck put it, They say what they want. I do what I want, but Bismarck really didn't really mean it. Fernargle does. In general, Fernargle has no reason to at all to impose any artificial restriction on his subjects. He will impose laws only in order to prevent violence, which reduces gold production. He has no interest at all in victimless crimes. Since he can define failure or pay one's taxes theft from him, Fernargle, the vast and pugnant one, it turns out that he operates a very normal system of law. It turns out that except for the 30 to 40% of your economic output that disappears into his gold stash, Fernargle is actually an ideal ruler, far from being totalitarian. The Farnagocracy is anything, if anything, remarkably libertarian. Does Fernargle mind you if you light up a J? Not in the slightest. Why is Fernargle's behavior so different from that of totalitarian dictators? What is the difference between Fernargle and the most powerful men of the 20th century? Nasty pieces of work like Mustache Man, Stalin, and Mao. The difference is that Fernargle's primary property, Planet 3, is secured by his magical powers of invulnerability, and Finger Snap of Death is secure. Well, all this thought experiment shows is there's no such thing as secure property.
Right. I mean, there are a whole lot of problems with this. There are a lot of problems with this. I mean, first off, he's assuming infinite rationality on this guy's end, right? And then he's saying, "Oh, well, the difference between him and other totalitarian leaders must be security." Well, no. Scroll up and let's go back through all the assumptions he made about Fernargle. I want
Yeah,
to see
okay,
all
hold
of
on.
them.
Yeah, we're doing it. We're doing it.
We're doing it.
Okay.
I want to see which could be the culprit.
Okay, hold on. We gotta go way back. Okay, right up here. Here we go.
Okay. Okay. So he's invulnerable, can't be harmed by any weapon, has the power to kill any human or humans anytime, and other than that, he has no powers. Okay. But he's also infinitely rational. Scroll up a little bit more. Yeah, there you go. He's also rational, amoral, omnipotent, and avaricious. So I want to write this down. Give me a second. There's a whole list of them here.
Okay.
I want to go through them.
Okay, let's do this. So basically, in typical Sam Hyde fashion, we're coming for you, Fernargle, in real life.
So rational, amoral, omnipotent, and avaricious. Omnipotent, avaricious. Let's see, invulnerable. Instantly kill. I think I got them all. That's a lot. That's a
Okay.
lot of assumptions. Okay, so let's go through these like one at a time, right? What's the difference between Fernargle and our dictators? Well, are dictators with absolute power, even secure absolute power, necessarily rational?
No.
No. In fact, who defines what rationality looks like anyway? That
Whatever's
seems
in
like a
your
moral
rational
question to me.
toleration. Well, even libertarians will say that they're only telling you how to achieve goals, not what goals
What
to
your
go
goals
for.
are. Exactly. See, the problem is Fernargle here has a rational goal of only getting gold. But what if Fernargle has a goal that he's trying to rationally maximize of getting gold and lighting humans on fire, right? And he's trying to maximize both. So who's to say that getting gold is more rational than getting gold and also lighting any humans on fire you can get away with, right? I mean, if as long as it doesn't halt gold production, then great. Um, Amoral, right? I mean, I don't know if you're a libertarian, is extracting gold from a planet just because you have the power to do so a moral thing to do? I think it violates the NAP, don't you? We didn't aggress upon Fernargle, and Fernargle's coming over here and taking all of our gold. So a
And
libertarian would
Fernargle didn't get it. It wasn't gifted to him. He didn't homestead it, and he didn't buy it.
right. So I mean, there's that. But I mean, what makes Fernargle different than other dictators? Are other dictators going to be amoral in this odd sense of wanting some hyper specific thing like gold? No. Dictators throughout history, like say Genghis Khan, also wanted women, even non-consensually. Dictators want stuff that they'll take from other countries by force, and they will conscript people to fight for them to do so. So they're not going to be like Fernargle here and be amoral. Let's see. Are other dictators omnipotent? No. And what does that get you? It gets you paranoia, because if you have a lot of power and you have a seat of power that other people can take from you, so the seat of power is secure. Here's the point. Here's the point. The dictator who has the power is secure in that power. There's not going to be a revolution that upends a power structure. But the seat of that power, like who fills the seat, might be up for debate. So your dictator won. The seat of power is secure. Nobody's going to take that from you, but somebody else could occupy your seat. Now you're going to be a bit more paranoid. Now you'll go after the press more. Now you'll be watching your political opponents. Now you'll have the army acting in very, very totalitarian ways to make sure nobody's out to get you, because they have incentive to be out to get you. So dictators aren't omnipotent, even if the power structure they represent is secure. What's another one? Avaricious, right? Other dictators might not just be feel to be avaricious. They could instead just be sadistic instead. Maybe they want to maximize the pain of their subjects instead of maximizing gold. There have been monarchs, I think, like in Russia and other places, that literally just that's what they like to do, is just torture their people. I mean, that's a very common thing through history. Even if their power is secure, they make it unsecure in the long run, because they just torture their people all the time. Invulnerable. Whoever's occupying a secure seat of power might not be invulnerable. This goes with the omnipotent thing. The ability to instantly kill one's political dissidents, right? Suppose Fernargle had all of his powers, but he didn't have the power to snap his fingers and instantly kill the people of Earth. Well, he has to be carried around to walk. So what's Fernargle going to do if people just stop carrying him around? He can't stop their hearts with his fingers anymore and threaten them to tend to his every whim. Well, now Fernargle needs an army. He has to have an actual army to force people to be his slaves, and hence you'll get totalitarianism again, right? So there's 5 or more assumptions he's built into Fernargle to make Fernargle a benevolent ruler by design, that wouldn't exist for any human dictator. And he's like, the core difference between these two things is security of the seat of power. It's like, no, it's not. You're dumb. You're an absolute idiot.
Well, all he's proven is that you can't have security in that sense, because given the nature of the thought experiment, nobody could possibly have that.
Yeah, if you need all those to have secure power, it's impossible. But if those are different from security, then security is not sufficient. Either way, in the dilemma, he's screwed.
Yeah. In fact, vulnerability and finger snap performing basically the same service for Fernargle that Officer Friendly did for me. Oh, okay, Logos. This is for you.
That is not true. It's not true. I mean, what? The point is, a dictator with Officer Friendly at his disposal is still not invulnerable, right? You could send Officer Friendly off to investigate some dissidents, and then somebody else could sneak into the palace and assassinate you while Officer Friendly's away. So you know what's better than one Officer Friendly? 2 Officer Friendlies. You know what's better than 2 Officer Friendlies? Thousands of Officer Friendlies that are always checking in on your would-be political enemies, right? He really fundamentally does not understand how much invulnerability gets you and what dictators would have to do to make that demand. It's not having a police force. It's having a totalitarian army watching everybody's movements at all times.
Yeah. Okay. The reason the 1,000-year Fnarg is peaceful and free is that we've defined Fnargle's primary rights so that it works just like a secondary right. If one day Fnargle tries to snap his fingers and it doesn't work, darn, he says, problems will arise. Mustache Man Stalin and Mao, on the other hand, had enemies. Stalin and Mao especially basically operated under the assumption that everyone in the world wanted to kill them and take their jobs. After a while, this was quite the self-fulfilling prophecy. Terrorist government, as in the Reign of Terror, a usage that unfortunately lapsed, is a consequence of not an absolute primary title, but of insecure primary title. It is best understood as a form of civil war. Unfortunately, Fnargle's magical powers are beyond the reach of us Earthlings. So how do we emulate the 1,000-year, or better yet, eternal Fnarg? Or is there some obvious problem with the whole idea of Fnargocracy? Readers' opinions are as usual welcome. Okay, well, so some questions that we have, he's promising to give us an answer. But I think the most telling thing of this whole dumpster fire is he mentions the United Nations. So the only way to have primary property is a world government. So how is it that one property owner of the whole world is anything different than a communist dictator owning the whole world?
Yeah.
It's not. In which case, what is this? What is this? This is just gobbledygook. And then furthermore, given this elaborate Finargle thought experiment, there's no such thing as primary control. So you're saying that you define, what was it, rights? Or was it power? Let's see. Sovereignty is having primary control. Well, then, okay, the whole point is to remove ambiguity so that we know what represents what. But you've just defined sovereignty in terms of a variable that is, by your own definition, impossible. Like, what do you say to that, Logos?
Well, I think I've already done it. It's just a dilemma. He's screwed either which way he goes. So I don't know what it intends to do.
Well, at this point, this is going to be a bit of a long one. We're already 2 hours and 40 minutes in. Do you just want to wrap it up here, Logos, and give some closing thoughts?
Sure, that sounds like a good idea to me.
All right. So I think it's clear, at least from what I've seen in all these articles. One, Moldbug. Okay, you know what? You know what it is? I'm going to sum it up all in one movie quote. Princess Bride. You keep on using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means. That's literally all of Moldbug in a nutshell. But let's get back to the actual misused words. Idealism, terribly misused. Sovereignty, terribly misused. I know you had some of your own logos that you can point to a little bit later. You you claim to be giving us an ideology that clarifies, but all of your see basically he's a math science tech bro, right? He's defining everything as independent variables that we don't know what their values are. So what good is it if everything has these unknown values? What you want to have is dependent variables, and we know what the values are, then we can define things. If you're coming from a scientific computer programming mindset, isn't that what you do, Logos?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean other words he misused were independence and dependence and primary and secondary with his use of property. Um, you know, I already went over those. I don't want to go over them again. To summarize what went wrong, um, just to recap the whole thing, I guess. So the Schrodinger's democracy meme that I established over the last couple can now be replaced by the Schrodinger's young chimp, old chimp problem. What are you the young chimp? What are the old chimp? The young chimp should have the power. The old chimp should step aside for the safety of the pack. So there's violence eliminated. But how do you know whether the young chimp or the old chimp unless you open the box? The only way to open the box is violence. So that's done. Um, he admits there's no way to have an amoral society by which we just merely dictate who has power and act according to a rule of law. To truly live amorally would be to be nihilistic, which he says is impossible. So that's done. Even if the Schrodinger's young chimp old chimp problem didn't persist, he already admitted as to why he's not a nihilist, that his own goal is an impossible thing to obtain, and I don't see why we should entertain a political system based upon something by its creator's own admission is impossible to do. Um, then you have the problem of primary and secondary ownership, and he seems to fundamentally misunderstand that he thinks that like a government or a person could be like a sovereign primary property holder of property occupied by their people. But what he fails to understand is Officer Peaceful, or whatever he called the officer's name, can voluntarily choose to or not to work for that government. So like right now in Iran, there's revolutions. Like riot police are like quitting and like protesting with the protesters instead of working for the government because they think the government's crossed the line. Well, if you can lose control of your officers, then you can lose control of the property you ostensibly own under the officer's jurisdiction. So did you really have primary control of the property? No, you have secondary control of the property, just like everybody else, through the use of those police officers. Those officers work for the people, and they work for you because you work for the people. There's a tension act there. Sometimes the officers have to buck the people to keep martial law, things like that. Sometimes they have to ally with the people against the tyrannical dictators to keep their heads, if nothing else. Some people know where these officers live, right? So there's a very complex relationship there. It's not like Officer Peaceful is just some pawn of the government that always does the government's bidding. In no way is it a stand in for invulnerability or omnipotence. Not even close, because the officers have their own will and so on. Um, so he fundamentally misunderstands what it takes to have primary control of one's property. You'd have to be like on a desert island alone, basically, in order to have that happen. If there are any other people around you, all primary control means is like you have the ability to defend yourself if somebody else tries to take it from you. Doesn't mean you'll be successful. And so all property is kind of de facto secondary in the sense that like you're controlling a property depends on one or more persons who could have more power than you not deciding to take your property from you. And that would work for a government when it comes to like the 1917 revolution or the French Revolution or whatever revolution you want to speak of. That goes for persons, that goes for all sorts of things. And it's that fundamental misunderstanding that makes him think he can be a totalitarian and everything is going to be okay. It also trickles into misunderstanding what makes totalitarians totalitarians. It's not their security, it's the whole list of other things that I went over on top of it. I mean, so far, we've gone 3 weekends now. I think we're almost 12 hours, no, 9 hours deep into this. And you'd think in 9 hours of going and going and going, he'd be clarifying and fixing the problems and, trying to work things out. But 9 hours in, everything just looks worse than the very first article he started in.
No,
And so, yeah.
real quick, compared to the first article, compared to where we're at now, the first article was crystal clear. Where we're
Yes.
at now, right? And that was problematic enough. But compared to where we're at now, it's like that was crystal clear.
Right.
The other thing too is, given the only way to have primary ownership is world government, because you mentioned the UN is the only institution that could, in theory, have it. How is a single individual who owns the whole world any different than global communism, the very thing that libertarians abhor?
Well, exactly.
This is going to be my hot take. Okay, I've already mentioned this is not a hot take. Moldbug represents the petite bourgeoisie and the insurgent tech management class overthrowing the older neoliberal class of Lippmann and McNamara. But this is the hot take, okay? There is all the stuff that we've read, just on the face of it, doesn't make sense. Is there any underlying hidden secrets or maybe Easter eggs that Moldbug has given us that we can sort of make sense of all this? The only thing that makes sense once you apply, formal logic like you and I have, Logos, to all of these discrete claims, which just kind of dissolve into the ether, is that one, Moldbug is a Stirnerite. Two, Moldbug believes force is the sole way of gaining power, which, by the way, so did the Marxists. Stalin and Mao said much the same thing. Three, while he says he doesn't want violence, he actually does, because everything that he says will necessarily increase violence. The young chimp, Schrodinger's chimp. And so this is the hot take. He's actually a Stirnerite anarchist who's advocating for the dissolution of all political structures in order to have an illegalist, paradise where everybody's got mutually assured destruction going on, where, I won't stab you in the neck because you won't stab me in the neck. That's my hot take. Logos?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, he says that's not what he wants because there's no rule of law and there's always uncertainty, right? Because your neighbor says they won't stab you, but they might think they can get away with it one day, and so you never know. So you'll sleep with one eye open or whatever. But like, it's hard to say that that's not where the system gets him, because the second you say, I don't care who has power from a moral perspective as long as somebody does and we know who it is, well, now everybody else who does care about power is going to say, great, let's figure out who has power. Wink, wink. All the guns come out and people start firing. So, like, it's going to get there anyway, either as an intermediate stage or a final stage. I mean, it seems to be a worst case scenario. We end up back playing the game of how we get these states in the first place, where you have all these people saying, I should have power. They fight. Warlordism happens. A state's formed eventually to fight other bigger states. You get a centralized power structure, but a centralized power structure having to serve so many interests and keep up with so many moving parts ends up having power obfuscated because you need to grease so many palms to get large armies moving across continents and whatever else you want to do. Like, it all ends up back to where we started again. Nothing you said gets us out of the cycle. It only gives us a lot of amount of short-term violence in the interim. So,
well, also too, let's go back to his formalism article to further consolidate my hot take. His entire objection was that things aren't called what they are. So everything is a simulation of violence and conflict. We call it democracy. We call it politics. What he wants is for violence to be reified in the sense that we just resolve all of our disputes with violence because we understand where power is, where power comes from, what power is, and we just dispense with all of this, smoke screen and moral pearl clutching, and just call it what it is. And we just have this, universal illegalist, mutually assured destruction society. Now, if you take that, all of the Easter eggs he's been littering for us make sense. And in fact, it's again, hot take, the only thing that I think makes sense out of all this.
Yeah, I don't think I can disagree with that.
All right, guys. Well, we're at the end of this. And don't worry, there's more to come. Logos and I will. It takes an autist to beat an autist, so we're coming at you hard and fast. Don't forget again to subscribe to me on Telegram, Twitter, and Locals. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Thanks again, Logos, as always. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.